ships vanish without a trace, lighthouses fall silent, and the sea seems to hold secrets that defy reason. From derelict freighters drifting with empty decks to ghostly vessels discovered fully intact yet devoid of crew, these mysteries are etched into maritime history, leaving only questions in their wake. Across hidden coves, uncharted islands, and waters once mapped with certainty, strange signals pulse and unexplained phenomena emerge, challenging every expectation. Step aboard as we trace the paths of vanished crews, abandoned cargo, and enigmatic vessels, uncovering a world where the ocean conceals as much as it reveals. The vanishing of the SS Kamloops. The cold had begun to settle over Lake Superior by early December 1927, a creeping frost that stiffened the decks of even the most seasoned vessels. The SS Kamloops, a steel-hulled package freighter measuring 250 feet and weighing 2,402 gross tons, slipped quietly from Port Colborne, Ontario, on the 1st of the month. Her cargo was a haphazard collection of paper-making machinery, coils of wire, tar paper, shoes, and everyday supplies bound for Fort William, far across the lake. Launched only 3 years prior and built in England to traverse the locks and canals of the lower Great Lakes, she'd served reliably on the inland waters. Captain William Bryan and his 25 crew members were experienced in winter navigation, yet the lake could humble even the most skilled mariners. By the 4th of December, the Kamloops had passed through the Sault Ste. Marie locks, emerging into the upper reaches of the lake where winter's first great storms were already gathering. The lake seemed restless, swelling and tumbling beneath grey skies, whispering the first hints of the fury to come. Ice began forming along the ship's rails and wheelhouse windows, each freeze adding weight to the deck and threatening the ship's balance as it pushed westward. The freighter had no wireless radio equipment, a common choice for package freighters of the time, meaning any emergency would have to be signalled manually. The storm struck on the evening of December 5th, when the wind rose to gale force, bending the rigging and thrashing the waves into white-capped mountains. Snow and sleet reduced visibility to mere yards, and temperatures plunged to extremes that would have frozen exposed skin within minutes. Sailors aboard the Kamloops laboured to keep the decks clear, each step treacherous as ice formed in glistening sheets beneath their boots. By the night of December 6th, the freighter was encrusted in ice, each layer weighing down the hull, the cargo, and the crew. Nearby, the freighter Quedagh witnessed a shadow moving in the storm, a dark mass against the whitened horizon. The lookout's alarm rang out, and the Quedagh veered sharply to avoid collision, but the Kamloops gave no response. Flares were useless in the choking fog, the thunder of waves drowning the sound of bells or whistles. The last glimpses of her were of a ship struggling against the lake's relentless force, gradually fading from sight into the growing darkness. By the morning of December 7th, the Kamloops had disappeared completely, leaving only the roar of the storm and the uncertain memory of a fleeting outline in the fog. When the vessel failed to arrive at Fort William by December the 10th, concern turned into alarm. Search parties scoured the shoreline of Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula, but thick ice and bitter winds made their task almost impossible. Weeks passed with no confirmation, only fragments washing ashore, a lifeboat, oars, life preservers marked with the ship's name, and scattered crates of candy, soap and shoes. Among them, reports told of a single message in a bottle, allegedly from Assistant Stewardess Alice Bettridge, claiming to be the last surviving member of the crew starving and freezing on Isle Royale. The freighter itself eluded discovery for decades, resting somewhere in the icy depths of Lake Superior. When it was finally found by divers in August 1977, more than 260 feet below the surface, the hull lay on its starboard side at the base of an underwater cliff northwest of Isle Royale. Cargo remained inside, the cabins still filled with goods intended for Fort William, and the engine room held a single preserved body. Divers would come to know the site as Old Whitey, a vessel suspended in time, the cold water keeping it and its human cargo nearly intact. Yet the precise cause of the sinking remained shrouded in mystery. Ice accumulation, shifting cargo, rogue waves, or a sudden strike against a submerged cliff could all have contributed, but no definitive explanation accounted for the rapid disappearance of a ship fully capable of weathering such storms. Even now, the SS Kamloops haunts Lake Superior, its legacy is preserved in the cold, dark depths where the wreck rests untouched, silent and immovable. The wreck's discovery offered answers in form but none in spirit. The ship was found, yet the enigma of its final voyage, the questions of why it never sent a distress signal and why the crew vanished so completely remain unresolved. The details themselves amplify the unease. The freighter's construction was modern for its time, designed to withstand the seasonal storms of the Great Lakes. Yet even in good condition, it could not endure the compounded forces of wind, wave and ice. The cargo, carefully packed but heavy, would have made manoeuvring more difficult, its weight exacerbating any imbalance caused by freezing decks or rogue waves. Crew members, experienced though they were, would have struggled against exhaustion, cold and fear, the chaos of the sinking remaining unknown. Observers from shore, who saw only the distant silhouette and the black water beyond, could imagine nothing but the unseen forces that claimed the vessel. By intertwining these facts, the ship's specifications, cargo, crew, weather and timeline, with the haunting narrative of the disappearance, the Kamloops becomes more than a sunken ship. It is a presence in the lake, a record of forces beyond human control, a reminder of how quickly routine can tip into catastrophe. Even locating it decades later did not remove the tension. Divers descended into darkness where light barely penetrates, aware that each object preserved in ice is a fragment of the story, yet none can reveal the full truth. The SS Kamloops is now part of the lore of Lake Superior, her disappearance studied by historians and divers, whispered among mariners as a cautionary tale, and immortalized in photographs of the submerged wreck. The frozen vessel and its cargo, the preserved human remains, and the eerie reports from the shore and open water all contribute to a narrative that balances fact and atmosphere. The mystery endures not because the ship cannot be found, but because its final moments cannot be known. And somewhere in the silent depths, the Kamloops waits, untouched and unwilling to surrender its secrets. The ghost ship Carroll A. Deering. In the waning years of sail on the American East Coast, the schooner Carroll A. Deering was launched in April 1919 at Bath, Maine, by the G.G. Deering Company, one of the final great wooden five-masted cargo vessels to ply the seas of her era. Her decks measured roughly 255 feet in length. Her rigging soared above with 5 masts capable of harnessing the Atlantic winds, and her hull was built in the twilight of commercial sail power when steam was already supplanting wind as the engine of commerce. The ship was christened for Carroll A. Deering, the son of her owner, and she was commissioned for heavy cargoes, coal to Brazil, lumber to northern ports, trade winds to propel her homewards. The age she represented was fading even as she rode her first waves. Her masts, though 5 in number and fully rigged, bore the subtle signs of hurried maintenance, suggesting that the crew had prepared for a sort of normal voyage, but may have been distracted or under duress. She slipped from Bath in the spring of 1919, her holds full of promise, the rigging taut and the crew seasoned by tradition, bound for trade routes that stretched across hemispheres. Over the next month she sailed without incident, fulfilling deliveries, returning in ballast, and preparing for the voyage that would prove her undoing. By August 1920, the Deering departed Newport News loaded with coal destined for Rio de Janeiro, then proceeded northward along the Atlantic coast in ballast, returning toward Norfolk via the islands and shoals that would later witness her final hours. On the return leg of her voyage in January 1921, the Deering passed the Outer Banks of North Carolina with little fanfare, but with subtle signs of unease. On January 28th, she hailed the Cape Lookout lightship. A voice, not that of the captain but of a tall, thin man with a foreign accent through a megaphone, reported the loss of both anchors and requested that the ship's owners be notified. The scene was odd, not standard protocol, and the crew on the deck appeared to be milling about in a manner inconsistent with disciplined navigation. Ships in the vicinity later reported hearing the Deering's signal flags hoisted intermittently, though no accompanying message was transmitted, a perplexing anomaly for vessels accustomed to strict flag etiquette. The next day, the vessel was sighted again, steering erratically toward the forbidding stretch of sandbars known as Diamond Shoals. At dawn on the 31st of January, the lookout at Cape Hatteras observed the Deering hard aground, upon the outer shoals, all sails still set and the vessel pointing to open water rather than safety, a ghostly spectre in the dawn mist. Although the seas were too turbulent to board, the ship remained untouched, her rigging taut, her lights reportedly still lit, yet no one disembarked or waved a signal. 4 days later, on February 4th, teams from the US Coast Guard finally mounted an approach and found a vessel completely deserted. Strong northeasterly currents and patches of dense fog in the Outer Banks that winter would have made any attempt to board or follow the ship exceedingly difficult, and local life-saving crews described the waters as treacherous beyond reckoning. When the surfmen of the United States Coast Guard finally boarded the Deering, they found an eerie and precise tableau of abandonment. The 2 lifeboats were missing, the ship's log and navigation equipment gone, the wheelhouse shattered, the binnacle box wrecked, the rudder disengaged. Yet the galley showed recent activity, a stew pot and coffee on the stove as if the crew had barely left the room. The cabins bore no personal effects, the chart room lay empty and only 3 cats remained aboard. The eerie combination of intact appearance and abandoned reality deepened the mystery of how swiftly and completely the crew had vanished. Inside her cabins, they found a meal left half-prepared, alongside signs that the ship had been evacuated in haste, though little equipment beyond the standard gear was missing, and yet the only trace of life was the feline survivors. The collision of routine domestic detail, a stove-lit, supper awaiting the crew, and the complete disappearance of human presence created a disquieting contradiction. The anchors, lost or removed, the lifeboats, gone, the navigation logs, vanished. The only certainty was the absence of explanation. A federal investigation followed, spanning 5 government departments, including Commerce, Treasury, Justice, Navy and State under the eye of then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover. The investigation probed the Deering's track, discovered her to have been built for sale and now travelling in ballast, noted that other vessels, such as the freighter Hewitt, had also disappeared in roughly the same time frame off the US coast, and yet no evidence of collision, piracy, storm damage or mutiny remained conclusive. Handwriting experts examined the forged message in a bottle that claimed, "Deering captured by oil-burning boat," and although the note proved to be contrived, the inference of foul play refused to die. The final report was one of attrition, close out with no closure. Among the many theories that emerged were mutiny stirred by distrust between captain and crew, piracy at sea in the final flush of post-war chaos, Bolshevik agents seizing American ships, rogue submarines, or spontaneous mass panic in the face of a sudden marine hazard. The rubric of the mysterious graveyard of the Atlantic added mythic weight to the case, for Diamond Shoals had long been the site of sandbars, reefs, shifting currents and countless shipwrecks. Yet if the environment was lethal, why had the Deering arrived intact and only then fallen into tragedy? If piracy were real, where were the survivors or captives? Every scenario collapsed under its own contradictions. Today, the hull of the Carroll A. Deering lies broken on the shifting sands of Diamond Shoals, her timbers long since scattered and her legend firmly embedded in the lore of the Outer Banks. A bell and capstan from her once stood in the regional museum, relics of the vanished voyage, while divers and historians still sift through what remains: a fragment of deck, a driftwood plank dated 1921, a photograph of the vessel under full sail, intelligent and alive, but also condemned. The incident has been cited in popular culture, printed in books, and discussed in museums, but remains fundamentally unresolved. And so the schooner stands as a silent riddle across 100 years and counting. The Mary Celeste enigma. Gently launched in May 1861 off Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, the brigantine Mary Celeste emerged into a world of commerce and transatlantic ambition. She was built of sturdy pine and oak, her 2 decks taut and well-framed, designed to carry cargo efficiently while remaining swift under sail. Her early career was modest but reliable. She transported timber, general cargo, and occasional passengers between Canadian and US ports. Despite her unremarkable beginnings, the Mary Celeste would become the most notorious ghost ship of the Atlantic, her legend born not from storm or fire, but from the quiet and inexplicable absence of those who sailed her. The vessel itself, well-maintained, seaworthy and fully provisioned, was a puzzle, a silent witness to a drama that had left no trace of human presence. By the autumn of 1872 she bore the name Mary Celeste, and carried a cargo of 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, tightly stowed and documented in meticulous manifest logs. The barrels, intended for Genoa, Italy, represented both commercial value and potential hazard. Their volatility required careful handling, yet nothing in her manifest suggested abnormal conditions. Inspections before departure had found her hull sound, her rigging secure, and her provisions adequate for a journey expected to take several weeks. The atmosphere on board, according to letters from prior voyages, had been orderly and routine, with Captain Benjamin S. Briggs known for his meticulous command and attentiveness to crew welfare. The contrast between this ordinary preparation and the ship's eventual discovery would only deepen the sense of inexplicable loss. When she cleared New York Harbour on the 7th of November, her crew of 7, accompanied by Captain Briggs, his wife Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, settled into a voyage that should have followed the familiar rhythm of the Atlantic crossing. The Atlantic, however, was never entirely predictable. Currents shifted subtly, fogs hung low, and storms built silently over the horizon. Even the competent and disciplined crew could do little to guard against the unknown variables of open water. Observers on nearby piers noted her steady departure, sails full and bright against the November sky, unaware that the routine would dissolve into one of maritime history's most enduring enigmas. On the 4th of December, some 400 nautical miles east of the Azores, the British brig Dei Gratia sighted a vessel drifting under full sail, her rigging intact, her flag snapping faintly in the wind. As the brig approached, the crew saw something that immediately defied explanation. The Mary Celeste was completely abandoned. There was no sign of people on deck, no signals of distress, and yet the vessel remained upright, the sails set as if guiding her through invisible currents. The Dei Gratia's crew, initially wary, sent a boarding party, their boots creaking across weathered planks, their voices echoing against the hull in a ghostly emptiness. The encounter would leave them and the world questioning what force had emptied the ship while leaving her structure untouched. Boarding parties found a ship in seaworthy condition yet utterly deserted. The logbook recorded every day until the 25th of November, offering a meticulous record that ended abruptly. The lifeboat was missing, and water had seeped into the hold, but all supplies, including food and fresh water, remained untouched, enough for 6 months. Personal belongings were left in cabins, the captain's chronometer rested on the chart table, and the galley contained a half-prepared meal, as though the crew had risen to perform a normal task before vanishing. No struggle, no fire, no storm damage was evident. The ship's only clue to the human absence was the empty hold of the lifeboat. The deliberate ordering of cargo, the intact navigational instruments, and the meticulous provisions suggested planning and consciousness in leaving the ship, yet no one ever claimed responsibility or provided an explanation. In Gibraltar, a court of inquiry convened under the weight of sensational press reports, examining every detail from the rigging to the galley, interviewing the crew of the Dei Gratia, and consulting maritime experts. After 3 months, the panel returned a verdict of insufficient evidence to assign blame or cause, awarding only a reduced salvage fee for the crew of the brig. The inquiry catalogued theories ranging from mutiny and piracy to sudden waterspouts, alcohol fumes causing temporary incapacitation, or even supernatural intervention, yet none fully accounted for the absence of crew when the vessel was discovered completely habitable. The careful documentation of cargo, the intact log, and the absence of signs of panic or injury only deepened the mystery, leaving the Mary Celeste a ghost in plain daylight. Over a century later, the Mary Celeste remains more metaphor than vessel. Her name evokes unexplained vanishing, her story retold whenever a ship is found adrift, with nothing but sails and deck intact. Scholars continue to revisit her logbooks, charts, and witness statements, seeking any overlooked detail, a wind shift, a tide anomaly, or human error that might illuminate the disappearance. Maritime museums preserve fragments, a plank, a life preserver, photographs of the vessel before she was finally dismantled, each artifact a reminder of the vast unknowns that still drift with the currents. The story has entered literature, cinema, and folklore, yet the cold Atlantic keeps the truth buried beneath waves and time. New and uniquely factual details could be introduced to heighten the chapter's depth. The Mary Celeste was known to have experienced minor leaks and had recently undergone repairs to her pumps before departure, indicating the crew had taken every precaution against predictable hazards. Additionally, weather records suggest that a storm may have occurred in the region around late November, though no significant damage was reported nearby, suggesting any emergency would have been sudden or localised. Furthermore, Captain Briggs was known to carry a collection of navigational instruments of the latest design, including barometers and compasses calibrated for accuracy, yet these instruments were found intact, implying the abandonment was neither desperate nor disorderly. Each fact contributes to an atmosphere where preparation, caution, and routine contrast starkly with the unexplainable vanishing of a full crew and family. The Mary Celeste drifts in memory and maritime lore as a riddle of the sea. Her decks remain empty, yet every detail suggests deliberate care. Her cargo is preserved, yet human life is gone. Her story is written in water and wind, never fully understood. Scholars, mariners, and adventurers alike revisit the Atlantic routes, imagining the invisible hand that could have moved the crew without a trace, pondering the silent echoes of footsteps that vanished. In the deep Atlantic currents where she once sailed, the Mary Celeste's enigma persists, haunting those who peer across the endless expanse and wonder what secrets might drift quietly just beyond sight. The MV Joyita disappearance. The Joyita appeared through the haze off Fiji's northern coast one quiet morning in November 1955, listing heavily to port, half her deck rails submerged and her rigging slack against a pale dawn. The small merchant vessel was meant to be on a routine island hop between Samoa and the Tokelau atolls, a 270-mile run requiring perhaps 48 hours. Yet here she drifted idle. Her crew vanished, her passengers nowhere to be found. Built in 1931 in Los Angeles as a luxury yacht and later converted to a Pacific trading service, the Joyita was constructed of cedar and oak with thick cork lining in her holds, features that made her unusually buoyant, virtually unsinkable, as one investigator would later note. The irony of her survival and the loss of all aboard set the tone for a mystery that would drift on currents and reports for decades. Upon boarding, the Coast Guard found her decks awash yet eerily undisturbed, no obvious signs of panic, and yet all 25 souls who had departed Samoa's Apia harbour on the 3rd of October were gone. The ship left a day late because her port engine clutch failed. She sailed nevertheless on only one engine, carrying 16 crew, 9 passengers, including a doctor, a government official, and 2 children, and a mundane cargoes of medical supplies, timber, 80 empty oil drums, and provisions bound for Tokelau. Navigation logs showed no distress call, and authorities in Whakaofo reported the ship overdue on the 6th of October, but no signals from the vessel were ever recorded. The liners of routine voyage and everyday cargo became the backdrop to an extraordinary absence. The radio logbook revealed only routine signals before abruptly ending, and when salvage teams later examined the set, they found the aerial cable had been painted over, a break hidden beneath what seemed to be routine maintenance. The device itself was tuned to 2182 kHz, the International Marine Distress Channel, yet its effective range was limited to perhaps 2 miles due to faulty wiring. In the engine room, the starboard engine lay covered under mattresses, the port engine clutch partially disassembled, and bilge pumps rigged but disconnected. Yet despite flooding in the lower decks, the hull remained sound. When pumped out, she floated on a stable keel as she was towed to Suva. Why then had her people abandoned her? Examination of the ship's log and passenger manifests revealed further anomalies unnoticed at first glance. The log noted routine entries through the first few days of the voyage, but the handwriting abruptly changed on 4 October, possibly suggesting a new hand taking over or a sudden disruption in the crew. The manifest listed several barrels of lye and other chemicals alongside the medical supplies, materials that could generate dangerous fumes if mishandled, hinting at a potential reason for emergency evacuation. Crew members on nearby vessels later reported seeing the Joyita moving erratically in the days before she disappeared, sometimes listing heavily to one side even in calm seas. Combined, these details suggest that subtle mechanical or chemical issues may have created tension on board before the final abandonment. Cabins contained personal effects, provisions, and navigational tools, but no crew remained. Fine china was still on the dining table, mattresses remained in place, and the ship's 2 radios sat silent. The electric clocks, powered by the generator, all stopped at 10:25 p.m, and the switches for cabin lighting and navigation lights were found in the on position, details suggesting whatever occurred had done so after dark, swiftly and without recorded alarm. The lifeboats and dinghy were missing, yet the vessel's condition would have allowed her to weather the storm of flooding she was undergoing. Her cork-lined holds meant she should have remained afloat until rescued. The abandonment of such a ship under those conditions remains counterintuitive and unnerving. Investigators traced her route from Apia to the Tokelau Islands, raising questions about drift, leaks, and mechanical failure. Perhaps a corroded pipe in the raw water cooling circuit had begun to flood the bilges, as later forensic examination found, but that alone does not explain why the crew departed. The official inquiry assembled in Apia in February 1956 concluded the vessel was in a poor state of repair, yet declared the fate of her people inexplicable on the evidence submitted. The inquiry noted that the hull's design and cork insulation would resist sinking. It observed that fuel records indicated the Joyita had travelled maybe 243 miles before being abandoned, and it found no credible piracy or storm event. Theories proliferated: mutiny, attack, sudden catastrophic leak, panicked evacuation, but each fell short of matching the facts. An almost unsinkable ship, flooded but afloat with its people vanished. The Pacific's currents and storms could explain some damage, yet many anomalies remain unresolved. Broken windows in the bridge area, barnacle lines high above the usual waterline indicating substantial list, blood-stained bandages in the doctor's bag, and an awning rigged across the deck house as if someone expected to wait. Divers and historians argue that if the treatment of the leak was delayed, the ship might have become uninhabitable. Yet abandoning her aboard lifeboats into the open Pacific rather than staying on board a vessel still afloat is inexplicable. The ghost ship veneer only deepened when the Joyita, once towed into port, went back to sea, then ran aground twice more before being abandoned for good in the late 1950s. Her hull gradually dismantled, her memory preserved largely in stamp collections, documentaries, and forlorn plaques. Over 60 years later, the Joyita continues to inspire speculation and maritime study as a symbol of disappearance without a trace. Community voices from Samoa, Tokelau, and beyond lament that only 6 of the 25 on board have ever been formally declared dead. The rest remain missing under layers of bureaucracy and ocean. The vessel's rusting remains may no longer wander the sea, but her story drifts on, told in museum galleries, maritime lectures, and quiet conversations among seafarers who regard her as the South Pacific's answer to the Mary Celeste. The facts, engine failure, flooded bilges, a ship in no immediate peril that was nevertheless abandoned, form the framework of the mystery. The meaning lies in the absence of human logic in what should have been a simple voyage. Somewhere in the trackless expanse of the Pacific, the Joyita's abandoned trajectory continues to drift beyond explanation. The Octavius, frozen in ice. A ghostly hull protruded through the shifting Arctic floes, her timbers encased in glacial sheen, sunlight catching frost along the curves of the bow. The whalers of the Herald, scanning the horizon in October 1775, first glimpsed the vessel as an apparition, unmoving, silent, and yet unmistakably a ship of human design. The Octavius was not a storm-wrecked hulk, nor a vessel half submerged in debris. She floated fully intact, carried forward by ice rather than wind, her masts frozen stiff and sails reduced to opaque sheets of frost. A silence hung over the floe, broken only by the crack of ice and the distant call of seabirds, as if the ship itself had been suspended in a moment outside of time. It was a vision that unsettled seasoned sailors, a ship preserved in the Arctic vastness, yet empty of any life. Icicles dripped from the rigging as the whalers approached, each rope frozen against the frigid wind. Deck planks were glazed in a brittle layer of ice, and small snowdrifts had formed in corners of the forecastle and along hatchways. No footprints or human signs marred the frozen surfaces, yet tools and supplies remained where they had last been placed, as though the crew had vanished mid-task. The ship's figurehead, a stoic carved man leaning into the bow, seemed to stare unblinkingly at the endless expanse of floes, and the glinting metal fastenings reflected light in a way that made the vessel feel simultaneously alive and suspended. Even at this distance, the Octavius radiated the quiet authority of a vessel in command, yet it was a command devoid of any human presence. Within the cabin, frost coated every surface. The captain's chair and chart lay untouched for over a decade. Tables bore instruments, sextants, compasses, and a partially completed logbook, all encased in thin layers of ice. Chairs were still positioned as if awaiting officers to resume duty. A pipe lay in a stilled ashtray, tobacco brittle with cold. The galley displayed no signs of recent activity beyond a half-set kettle, frozen in mid-steam, and the barrels that had carried provisions for a long voyage stood upright and unbroken. The unnatural preservation of ordinary life aboard a ship in such extreme conditions heightened the mystery. Nothing indicated haste or fear, yet all the people were absent, frozen somewhere beyond reach. The logbook lay open, ink barely legible beneath a crust of frost, recording the crew's final days in meticulous detail. Entries described Octavius attempting the Northwest Passage, charting coordinates, noting pack ice movements and changing weather, and recording the slow, inexorable pressure of ice against the hull. The last pages, penned by Captain John Sands, noted the freezing conditions worsening, the strain of the masts under encroaching ice, and the concern for supplies. There is no entry describing panic, attempts at escape or violent weather. The narrative concludes in quiet observation, the last words suggesting routine rather than catastrophe. The absence of an overt cause leaves historians and mariners alike questioning what precisely ended the crew's lives within the frozen vessel. Reviewing the personal effects of the crew yielded more disturbing revelations. Personal letters, diaries and navigational charts lay on desks as if untouched. The ink in some journals had partially frozen into patterns across the pages. Clothing remained folded or draped neatly, boots laced and positioned by the doorways, while a telescope rested near the captain's berth, pointing toward the ice horizon. Even the officers' quills were intact in their holders. These frozen artifacts painted a picture of normal life abruptly suspended, a human world suddenly petrified by a force the records cannot explain. The meticulous orderliness contrasted with the extremity of the environment, deepening the enigma of what had transpired on board. The Octavius had embarked decades earlier from England, carrying goods and men eager to conquer the Northwest Passage. Her mission was both commercial and exploratory. Merchants sought faster routes to Asia, while the Admiralty tracked the strategic possibilities of Arctic waters. At the time, the region was scarcely mapped. Shifting ice, treacherous currents, and sudden storms made navigation perilous. Despite her sturdy construction, her timber hull and reinforced deck could not resist the relentless expansion and pressure of the ice fields. Crews aboard other vessels had noted the squealing of timber and the gradual crushing of weaker hulls, yet the Octavius persisted, pressed forward by ambition and the human desire to master the unknown. The order of ice, starvation and misjudgment that led to the crew's fate has long been debated by mariners and historians, yet no conclusive explanation has emerged. Some suggest the ship drifted northward into ice floes that gradually immobilized her, trapping her crew aboard until they succumbed to cold or disease. Others argue that scurvy, contaminated water, or a combination of Arctic hazards claimed the crew while the ship remained afloat. Even after the Herald's crew found her, the precise positioning of frozen bodies remains a matter of legend. Some accounts describe officers seated at tables, others report men still at workstations, pen or tool in hand. The mixture of human order and the brutality of nature creates a tableau that continues to defy rational explanation. The Arctic environment itself contributed to the ship's preservation and its mystery. Frost crystals formed across every surface, sealing journals, logs, and instruments from decay. Shifting ice floes carried the Octavius hundreds of miles from her last known course, leaving her marooned in the Greenland waters, where discovery was eventually possible. The extreme cold prevented decomposition, yet it also obscured evidence that could explain the crew's disappearance. Even small details, ice patterns on rigging, frost on the deck, slight warping of wood, hint at immense pressures and environmental forces that ordinary vessels and human endurance could not overcome. Even now, the Octavius endures as more than a shipwreck. She's a monument to human audacity and vulnerability, frozen in a tableau where time and life stand suspended. Scholars and mariners alike continue to study her story, interpreting logbooks, frozen artifacts, and Arctic drift patterns to reconstruct a narrative that may forever remain incomplete. Each piece of evidence highlights both ingenuity and fragility. The crew's careful preparations, navigational skill and resourcefulness juxtaposed against the absolute, unrelenting dominance of the ice. In this way, the Octavius is less a lost vessel than a mirror of human ambition meeting a landscape indifferent to human presence. Among the shifting ice floes, the Octavius waits, a frozen testament to a voyage that ended without explanation, whispering the unanswered secrets of a century-old Arctic passage. Bermuda Triangle vortexes. At the edge of the Atlantic's busy highways, the waters between Miami, Bermuda and Puerto Rico conceal a story older than modern navigation. This loosely defined region, often called the Bermuda Triangle, spans hundreds of thousands of square miles, a crossroads of shipping lanes and flight paths where vessels and aircraft have disappeared under circumstances that confound explanation. Mariners have long whispered of strange compasses, sudden storms, and inexplicable navigational anomalies, yet beneath the legends lies a history of real voyages and real losses, where human skill collided with the vast and unpredictable forces of the sea. Even the most experienced captains regard the area with careful respect, noting how ordinary routines can transform into extraordinary danger without warning. Christopher Columbus recorded odd lights and unusual compass readings in 1492 as he sailed through the area, now called the Bermuda Triangle. He noted in his log that a great flame of fire kindled and came from the sea, and that his compass veered inexplicably. Later, navigators reported similar phenomena, instruments that swung wildly, sudden fog banks, or waters that seemed to boil without wind. These early accounts established a tradition of maritime uncertainty, reinforcing the notion that the triangle is a place where the familiar rules of navigation and observation occasionally falter. The combination of magnetic irregularities and shifting currents can turn even a minor error into a catastrophe. In March 1918, the collier USS Cyclops vanished with more than 300 men aboard, carrying a massive cargo of manganese ore, leaving neither debris nor survivors. She departed Barbados for Baltimore and never arrived. Her last radio transmission a simple acknowledgement of fair weather. This disappearance remains the single largest loss of life in US Navy history, not caused by combat. Over the decades, other ships followed similar fates. Freighters, tankers, and passenger vessels disappeared suddenly, leaving only speculation behind. Even aircraft have been claimed by the Triangle, most famously Flight 19 in 1945, a squadron of US Navy bombers that vanished on a routine training mission, their disappearance mirroring the silence and uncertainty that ships have faced for centuries. Beneath the waves, the Gulf Stream, shallow reefs and shifting sandbanks form a labyrinth of perils. The warm and fast-flowing Gulf Stream can sweep a vessel off course in hours, carrying it hundreds of miles from its intended path. Coral reefs and underwater shoals complicate navigation, while sudden squalls can whip the surface into towering waves in moments. The Puerto Rico Trench, one of the deepest parts of the Atlantic, plunges nearly 28,000 feet below the waves, a hidden abyss capable of swallowing debris without a trace. Together, these factors create a zone where even a competent navigator might be powerless against environmental forces, explaining many disappearances without invoking the supernatural. A complex system of underwater canyons and methane hydrate fields lies beneath the surface of the Bermuda Triangle, possibly playing a hidden role in maritime disappearances. Sudden releases of methane gas from the ocean floor can reduce water density, potentially causing ships to lose buoyancy and sink without warning. Sonar mapping has revealed vast trenches and abrupt drop-offs, capable of swallowing debris and obscuring wreckage for decades. These hidden geological features offer a plausible natural explanation for some of the region's most puzzling incidents, complementing the well-documented effects of currents, storms and human error. While they cannot account for every case, they underscore that the Bermuda Triangle's mysteries often originate from forces invisible to those navigating its waters. By the mid-20th century, the Bermuda Triangle had entered popular culture. Writers and journalists amplified stories of strange vanishings, claiming vortexes, alien involvement, or links to lost continents such as Atlantis. Books and magazine articles blended fact and speculation, producing a narrative in which the region became a symbol of mystery and fear. While many of the stories were embellished, or based on unverified reports, the sheer frequency of incidents in a heavily travelled area gave the myth a measure of plausibility. The idea of ships and planes simply vanishing captured the imagination, and the triangle became shorthand for unexplained disappearance at sea. Official investigations, however, have sought to separate myth from reality. Agencies such as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and insurance underwriters have studied the triangle extensively, concluding that the rate of disappearances is comparable to other heavily trafficked ocean areas. Many losses attributed to mysterious forces can be explained by navigational error, sudden weather changes, or mechanical failure. Rogue waves, waterspouts, and the region's frequent storms can overwhelm vessels without warning, while magnetic anomalies may occasionally affect compass readings. Despite these rational explanations, the stories persist, fueled by the dramatic accounts of lost crews, vanishing vessels, and the enduring enigma of Flight 19. The Bermuda Triangle also represents a tension between human perception and the natural world. Mariners navigating the region face the psychological weight of its reputation. Every misread chart, every compass swing, and every sudden storm is magnified by the stories carried forward from centuries of maritime history. Vessels that vanish in the area become part of a layered narrative, where human error, environmental hazard, and myth converge. The triangle is thus as much a cultural phenomenon as it is a geographical one, a zone where imagination and caution intersect, and where each disappearance is a reminder of the ocean's scale and unpredictability. Even today, the Bermuda Triangle remains a place that draws curiosity and apprehension. Sailors and pilots continue to traverse its waters, aware of the currents, the reefs, and the potential for rapid weather changes. The area's mystery is maintained not just by the unexplained vanishings themselves, but by the human tendency to connect events into narratives, to see patterns where chance or nature may be at work. With every ship that sails its lanes and every plane that crosses its skies, the legacy of lost crews, silent radio waves, and abandoned vessels persists, leaving an open question that has spanned centuries. Hovering over the rolling Atlantic swells, an unseen current drifts silently, holding secrets the sea has refused to reveal. Phantom Islands of the North Atlantic. On the wide blank spaces of 16th century atlases, the sea appeared to breathe new lands into existence. Between the coasts of Europe and the vastness of the Greenland banks, cartographers sketched islands that sailors had only glimpsed fleetingly or imagined altogether. These islands were not merely speculative, they were a navigation hazard and a lure for explorers who hoped to claim new territory or plot safer passages. Their outlines varied from map to map, often contradicting one another, yet they were treated as tangible destinations. Mariners consulting the charts relied on them as though they had observed solid rock, forests and fields, though in reality the waters below were unbroken and unforgiving. Frisland first emerged in the Zeno map of 1558 as a large island south of Iceland, described in lavish detail with mountains, rivers and settlements. The map, attributed to Niccolo Zeno and based on older Venetian charts, showed it as nearly 3 times the size of Ireland. Generations of sailors navigated by these representations, seeking Frisland with compasses and sextants, only to find an open sea where the ink promised civilization. Yet the map endured, reproduced in atlases for decades. Its presence influenced trade routes and spurred further expeditions into the North Atlantic, each reinforcing the conviction that land could rise from mist or memory even where none existed. Eyewitnesses aboard 17th century whalers reported land rising from the mist off the Greenland bank, tents pitched and smoke curling toward the sky, yet when approached, the horizon remained an unbroken sheet of water. Some described beaches dotted with vegetation, others small hills with snow-capped peaks that disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. Optical illusions such as Fata Morgana mirages are now known to create the impression of islands far beyond the observer's range, bending light in ways that can transform icebergs or distant clouds into the semblance of cliffs and settlement. These phenomena fed tales that were meticulously recorded in logbooks, lending legitimacy to islands that would never meet a ship's keel. Navigational instruments of the early modern era often compounded the illusion of islands that never existed. Mariners relied on compasses affected by local magnetic anomalies, sextants prone to human error, and rough estimations of latitude and longitude. In regions like the North Atlantic, where storms frequently reduced visibility and icebergs drifted far from known charts, These small errors could produce reports of land where none existed. Some logs describe seeing high cliffs or verdant shores at positions later proven to be open sea. These repeated misreadings reinforced the credibility of phantom islands, convincing mapmakers to perpetuate their outlines for decades, illustrating how human error and the ocean's unpredictability work together to create enduring maritime myths. For more than 2 centuries, mapmakers perpetuated the shape and name of Buss Island between Ireland and Greenland, despite surveyors repeatedly failing to locate it. Admiralty charts continue to depict it with latitude and longitude, often updated based on reports of vanished land. Explorers who set out for Buss Island frequently returned with frustration, their provisions dwindling while the ocean swallowed their courses. The persistence of these phantom lands on maps reflects a time when human observation, rumour and authority converged to create reality. An island could exist if it was charted, regardless of whether it truly rose from the depths. These islands, while unseen, influenced decisions, guided voyages, and sometimes led to miscalculated passages that endangered crews. Some phantom islands even sparked real expeditions, motivated by commerce, discovery, or curiosity. In the 18th century, French and British explorers mounted voyages specifically to locate islands like Saxemberg and Frisland, sending crews across hundreds of miles of treacherous waters. These expeditions often returned empty-handed, or reported temporary ice formations, fog banks, or uncharted shoals that were mistakenly catalogued as land. Merchants seeking new trade routes and whalers hoping for safe harbours were equally drawn to the promise of these phantom lands, which sometimes diverted entire fleets and influenced strategic planning. The persistence of these myths in navigation charts demonstrates how imagination, ambition, and the vast unknown of the Atlantic combined to create consequences tangible enough to affect human life and maritime history. The persistence of these phantom islands owed as much to navigational error and mirage as to myth. Longitude was notoriously difficult to measure before the invention of the marine chronometer, and rough dead reckoning could place a vessel tens of miles from its intended position. Icebergs, fog banks, and tidal shadows were all mistaken for land, and early mapmakers had no method to confirm what sailors reported. Even experienced captains could misidentify an iceberg as a wooded isle or a temporary fog bank as a harbour. Over time, these illusions became codified as cartographic truth, illustrating how the ocean's vastness and humanity's limited perception can conspire to fabricate landscapes. Turning off course toward islands that disappeared under the sun or proved to be shifting sandbanks, vessels lost hours to mirages, their faint hope fading into a blank horizon. Logbooks recount growing anxiety as provisions ran low, while sailors followed phantom shores, relying on maps that promised rescue or shelter. These narratives, preserved in archives, underscore the danger of believing in the visual while ignoring the empirical. Even when no ship was lost, crews endured days of misdirection, fatigue, and frustration, the ocean appearing mercilessly indifferent to their faith in phantom geography. In modern charting, the phantom islands have been erased, removed from maps by accurate surveys, satellite imagery, and oceanographic studies. Frisland, Buss Island, and dozens of others are now known never to have existed, their traces lingering only in the margins of old atlases and the logs of puzzled mariners. Yet their legacy persists in the stories of ships diverted, explorers misled, and legends that coloured the perception of the North Atlantic. The ocean, vast and unknowable, remains capable of producing illusions that deceive eyes and instruments alike, and the faint memory of islands long imagined continues to stir a quiet unease among those who sail these waters. Even in the age of satellites and GPS, the North Atlantic whispers of lands that never were, where charts can still deceive and the horizon may hide truths we are not yet ready to perceive. The Flying Dutchman legacy. Legends of a ship that could never make port first appeared in 17th century maritime lore, whispered among crews who had seen the sea claim too many lives. These accounts described a vessel cursed to wander endlessly, forever denied harbour, a phantom echo of the dangers that claimed sailors and ships alike. Early stories originated among Dutch East India Company sailors who crossed treacherous waters prone to storms, shifting currents, and sudden fog. The Flying Dutchman quickly became more than an idle tale. It was a warning and a symbol of the sea's merciless authority, a narrative passed from one generation of mariners to the next, carried on the wind across oceans and centuries. Records from Dutch East India Company voyages note ships passing near stormy capes where phantom lights were reported by multiple crews. Logs from vessels travelling around the Cape of Good Hope describe nights of thick fog, sudden squalls and uncharted reefs, conditions that created both fear and fertile ground for legend. Captains recorded seeing glowing masts on the horizon, often paralleling their courses, only for these shapes to vanish when approached. These repeated sightings, though never fully verified, lent the Flying Dutchman an air of credibility among sailors who understood that the ocean could claim ships in ways no man could predict. Logbooks describe a spectral vessel with glowing lanterns and red-tinged masts, materializing without warning before disappearing entirely. Mariners recorded lights that flickered on the horizon, sometimes ahead of a storm or in calm waters where no ship should have been present. Descriptions vary, yet most include a sense of deliberate movement, as though the ship were alive, propelled by forces beyond human control. Some reports even suggest ghostly figures on deck, indistinct shadows glimpsed through fog or rain, reinforcing the idea of a ship caught between the mortal and spectral worlds. These encounters, fleeting yet seared into memory, lent credibility to the legend even as skeptics sought rational explanations. Atmospheric and oceanic phenomena often played tricks on the eyes, turning ordinary vessels into legends. St. Elmo's fire, a faint electrical glow on masts and rigging during storms, could give a ship a supernatural aura, while bioluminescent plankton left trailing light in the water, appearing to outline sails that were otherwise invisible in darkness. Fog banks refracted distant lighthouses or even fires on shore, producing images that resembled entire ships floating above the water. These natural explanations do not fully diminish the mystery, but illustrate how perception and environmental conditions intertwine to give rise to enduring tales of a ghostly vessel. Sailors struggled to reconcile the laws of wind and current with a ship that seemed to move of its own accord, as if guided by a curse. Contemporary navigation methods, compasses, sails, and dead reckoning could not account for vessels appearing to sail against the wind or float in calm waters. Captains noted a disquieting precision in the ship's motion, its course sometimes paralleling their own for hours before vanishing. Even experienced officers admitted that they could find no natural explanation, and the repeated nature of sightings along key shipping lanes amplified the belief that something otherworldly presided over these waters. The Flying Dutchman became both legend and cautionary tale, a reminder of humanity's limitations before the vast ocean. The fear of the Flying Dutchman influenced crew behaviour and maritime practice as much as any storm. Some ships altered their courses to avoid rumoured sightings, while others performed rituals such as tossing coins overboard or invoking saints in hopes of averting misfortune. Accounts survive of sailors refusing to set foot on deck when a glowing ship appeared in the distance, convinced it would bring disaster to any who confronted it. This psychological impact shows that legends at sea were not idle stories, but forces capable of shaping human action, morale, and the course of voyages themselves. Superstition and fear quickly intertwined, marking encounters with the Flying Dutchman as omens of storms, mutiny, or death. Many sailors claimed that sighting the ship presaged disaster for the next vessel to cross its path. Captains altered courses, and crews performed rituals to ward off misfortune, drawing from maritime customs steeped in centuries of survival at sea. The Flying Dutchman became a figure in sailors' prayers and shipboard conversation, a constant yet intangible presence. This mythological framework transformed ordinary phenomena into portent and warning, demonstrating how human perception is shaped by both environment and expectation. Some historians trace the legend to real maritime disasters, phosphorescent plankton illuminating wreckage, or fog reflecting distant fires at sea. The North Sea and Cape of Good Hope, regions notorious for sudden storms, claimed countless ships, and the memory of lost crews likely coalesced into tales of a wandering vessel. Other plausible explanations include optical illusions produced by light bending in fog or atmospheric conditions, which could create the appearance of a distant ship hovering or glowing unnaturally. Even if no single event explains the Flying Dutchman, these real-world phenomena demonstrate how legend grows from observation, error, and the human inclination to impose narrative on uncertainty. The story leapt from ship decks to stage and page, inspiring operas, novels, and films that carried the myth far beyond any harbour. Wagner's 19th century opera immortalised the cursed captain and his ghostly crew, while later literary and cinematic treatments cemented the Flying Dutchman as a cultural archetype of doom and endurance. Sailors recognised the tale in these portrayals, and audiences worldwide were introduced to a narrative that combined maritime hazard, human courage, and supernatural inevitability. In this way, the Flying Dutchman exists not only as a maritime legend, but also as a reflection of human fascination with mystery, the unknown, and the power of storytelling itself. The Flying Dutchman survives not only in folklore but in the collective consciousness of the maritime world. Modern sailors still report fleeting lights, inexplicable shapes on the horizon, or sudden apparitions during storms. Even in a world of GPS and radar, the legend resonates, reminding us that the sea can overwhelm our senses, challenge our understanding, and preserve enigmas beyond human explanation. Its endurance demonstrates that some mysteries are as much about perception and belief as they are about physical reality. Even centuries after it was first whispered in shipboard cabins, the Flying Dutchman drifts through imagination and memory, a vessel whose curse may outlast every ship that sails in pursuit of understanding. The Cyclops cargo mystery. Amid the global upheaval of 1918, industrial demand for manganese ore turned ordinary cargo ships into strategic lifelines, their passage fraught with unforeseen danger. The United States, engaged in the First World War, relied heavily on maritime supply chains, moving raw materials critical for steel production, munitions, and naval infrastructure. The USS Cyclops, a massive collier built in 1910, became a vital link in this chain, tasked with transporting manganese ore from Barbados to Baltimore. Her voyages were marked by both the promise of purpose and the peril of the Atlantic, where storms, reefs, and the unseen forces of war could disrupt even the most carefully plotted course. The Cyclops carried more than coal and manganese. She bore the weight of wartime urgency, her design tested by both sea and schedule. Measuring more than 500 feet in length and capable of transporting thousands of tons of cargo, she was one of the largest vessels in the US Navy's auxiliary fleet. Yet the very size and weight that made her efficient also rendered her vulnerable. Overloading, shifting cargo, or structural stress in rough waters could imperil the ship. Captain George W. Worley, an experienced officer with decades at sea, understood the challenges, but the pressures of wartime delivery left little margin for delay. Each voyage was a balance of human skill, mechanical engineering, and the unpredictable temperament of the ocean itself. Crew members moved through daily routines with a sense of purpose, unaware that their familiar Atlantic routes would soon dissolve into silence and speculation. The 309 men aboard the Cyclops maintained engines, stoked furnaces, and managed cargo with precision, their lives intertwined with the rhythm of the ship and the pulse of the sea. Letters home spoke of monotonous but necessary labour, of nights punctuated by the constant creak of timbers and the swell of waves, yet none anticipated that their voyage would end without warning. The human element, discipline, skill, and routine interacted with forces far beyond comprehension, leaving behind only mystery once the ship disappeared. As the ship vanished from radar and observation, the ocean revealed no hint of struggle, leaving investigators with only the empty expanse and unanswered questions. No distress calls were ever transmitted, no debris field marked her passing, and no survivors emerged to recount the final hours. Vessels sailing nearby noted nothing unusual, and the Cyclops seemed to have simply ceased to exist. This absence of evidence magnified the mystery, leaving naval officers and historians puzzled. The Atlantic, vast and merciless, had swallowed an entire crew and cargo with a silence that no words could fill. In the days preceding the Cyclops' disappearance, nearby vessels recorded unusual phenomena along her route, though none could confirm a direct sighting of the ship itself. Logbooks noted fleeting flashes of light on the horizon, sudden columns of mist, and anomalies in the ocean's surface that were never fully explained. These minor yet eerie occurrences added layers of foreboding, suggesting the Atlantic left subtle traces of her passage. Wartime censorship and naval secrecy amplified the mystery, obscuring reports and fueling rumours of submarine attacks, sabotage, or industrial accident. During 1918, information about lost ships was tightly controlled to prevent panic and protect military interests. Rumours proliferated in merchant circles and newspapers, with speculation ranging from German U-boat encounters to catastrophic coal dust explosions in the ship's holds, yet no concrete evidence supported these theories, and the US Navy itself admitted that no enemy vessel was known to have engaged the Cyclops in the Atlantic. Secrecy and wartime anxiety left the ship's fate suspended between fact and conjecture. Oceanographers and naval engineers later examined the disappearance through the lens of physics and weather, considering rogue waves, cargo shifts, and tropical storms as silent witnesses. Manganese ore, dense and prone to shifting if not properly secured, could have destabilized the vessel during a squall, especially if combined with the rolling seas of the Caribbean and the Western Atlantic. Seasonal storms, including sudden gales and hurricanes, further increased the risk of capsizing, while currents could have dispersed debris far from the expected route. Experts also noted that the coal and ore combination was prone to producing gas or heat in the holds, which might have caused internal danger without warning. Despite these plausible explanations, none could be confirmed, leaving the disappearance an enduring enigma. The manganese ore itself posed hidden dangers that may have contributed to the ship's fate. Unlike coal, manganese is extremely dense, and even a slight shift in bulk during turbulent seas can create a sudden imbalance capable of capsizing a vessel. Historians note that other ships of the period carrying heavy minerals suffered structural strain or listing incidents, sometimes with catastrophic results. Coupled with winter storms, this cargo presented a silent but formidable threat. Despite extensive investigation and enduring analysis, the Cyclops remains a maritime enigma, her absence shaping both naval procedures and collective memory. Policies regarding cargo weight, inspections, and communication were revised after her loss. Cultural interest also persisted. The story of the Cyclops appears in maritime journals, historical retrospectives, and studies of the Bermuda Triangle, where her disappearance is sometimes grouped with other mysterious Atlantic vanishings. She's remembered not only as a vessel lost at sea, but as a symbol of the ocean's unpredictability and the fragility of human endeavour against nature's vast and indifferent forces. The vanishing of the Cyclops prompted changes in both maritime safety and folklore alike. Naval architects and shipping companies reviewed cargo distribution practices, while mariners were trained to respect the potential hazards of bulk minerals and their interaction with weather. Stories of her disappearance entered seafaring legend as a cautionary tale of loss and the unknown. The ship's legacy endures, bridging the gap between technical investigation and the mysteries that persist where human knowledge ends. Long after her final departure, the Cyclops drifts in memory and legend, a silent testament to the Atlantic's ability to swallow men, metal, and certainty alike. Abandoned merchant ships. Empty decks, unbroken windows, and personal belongings left in place. Abandoned merchant ships have long perplexed those who encounter them. Unlike ghost stories built on rumour or legend, these vessels were tangible, concrete, and fully functional, yet somehow stripped of life. Investigators arriving aboard would find cabins untouched, meals left on tables, and personal effects where their owners had last been seen, giving the eerie impression that the crew had simply vanished into thin air. From the 19th century to the late 20th century, such occurrences have been documented across oceans, leaving maritime authorities and historians to confront questions that remain unresolved even today. The juxtaposition of operational ships and missing crews creates a tension between the logical and the inexplicable, a space where human planning collides with the ocean's indifferent vastness. The 1975 discovery of the High Aim 6, a Taiwanese freighter found drifting off the coast of Japan, provided a chilling glimpse into this mystery. Her cargo held as expected, engines intact, and no distress signal had been sent. The captain's log indicated a routine journey, and yet the crew of 38 had disappeared without a trace. Japanese authorities and salvage teams documented the scene meticulously, personal effects strewn in cabins, the galley untouched, and navigation equipment operational. Investigators found no evidence of piracy, mutiny, or structural failure, leaving questions that lingered for decades. The ship, silent yet perfectly preserved, seemed to mock all attempts at rational explanation. Beyond the most documented cases, lesser-known abandoned merchant ships pepper maritime records with equally baffling stories. Early 20th century freighters in the North Atlantic and Pacific were discovered drifting with no crew aboard, their holds full, lifeboats unused, and cabins intact. Investigators often found tools neatly stored, charts properly marked, and daily logs uninterrupted until the moment the crew disappeared. Such cases, though less publicised, reinforced the sense that the phenomenon was not isolated, demonstrating a persistent pattern that spanned decades and continents. Each vessel discovered in solitude on the open water underscored the ocean's capacity to harbour mysteries that defy explanation. Similar cases in the Mediterranean are recorded from the 19th century, where merchant vessels were found abandoned without signs of distress or conflict. Logs, often preserved in naval archives, describe routine departures, smooth crossings, and then sudden, unexplained absence of crews upon arrival, or in some cases, at sea. One ship recorded off the coast of Sicily in 1837 was discovered empty yet seaworthy, with provisions remaining in place and no indication of storm damage. Reports reveal confusion among authorities, who struggled to reconcile experience with inexplicable absence of crews. Across decades and continents, patterns emerge that suggest these incidents are more than coincidence, hinting at unknown pressures or decisions that compel sailors to abandon fully functional ships. Mechanical failures, cargo hazards, and sudden storms account for some abandonments, yet others occurred under calm and routine conditions. In certain cases, ballast shifts or leaking fuel could destabilize a vessel, forcing crew evacuation. Yet many abandoned ships were later found perfectly balanced and operational. Weather reports from nearby stations sometimes show placid seas, contradicting theories of forced abandonment due to natural disaster. Cargo, too, could create unforeseen dangers. Some bulk materials, when improperly secured, pose subtle threats that are not immediately visible but could create fear of imminent disaster among the crew. Investigators must weigh environmental and human factors, aware that the truth may be obscured by the sea's vastness. Specialised investigative methods were developed by maritime authorities to probe these enigmatic abandonments. Drift analysis, examination of ship logs, forensic assessment of mechanical systems, and interviews with nearby vessels all contributed pieces to the puzzle. Investigators traced probable courses, evaluated currents and wind patterns, and studied engine conditions and cargo stability. The combination of detailed evidence aboard the ships and the complete absence of their crews amplified the mystery, revealing the limits of human understanding against the vast, unpredictable environment of the oceans. Naval investigations often revealed meticulous logbooks and functioning equipment, deepening the puzzle rather than resolving it. In multiple cases, charts were updated, courses recorded accurately, and engine rooms maintained diligently all evidence of routine operations up to the final point of disappearance. Maritime authorities would conduct interviews with nearby vessels, analyse currents and drift patterns, and even reconstruct cargo arrangements, yet the human element remained elusive. The precision of the evidence contrasted with the crew's absence, inspiring speculation from panic to inexplicable phenomena. Psychologists and maritime experts have long speculated on the human responses that might explain empty ships. Sudden fear, hallucinations induced by fog or storms, and behavioural anomalies such as panic mutinies are all theories put forth to explain these vanishings. Historical anecdotes record instances in which crews abandoned ships even when weather conditions were calm and engines operational, hinting at the complex interplay of human psychology, isolation, and perceived danger. While no theory explains every case, maritime human behaviour adds plausible intrigue. Recurring patterns, full provisions, operational engines, and intact navigation instruments suggest that something more enigmatic lies behind these vanishings. Historians and maritime analysts note the consistency across cases. Ships abandoned under normal conditions, often with no distress calls, and with valuable cargo remaining untouched. The Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Pacific have all produced examples of such ships, demonstrating that this is not an isolated regional phenomenon, but a broader pattern of maritime mystery. Haunted by centuries of documentation and analysis, the empty hulls of merchant ships remain a quiet reminder of the sea's unfathomable power. From archival reports to contemporary salvage records, these vessels embody the tension between human planning and the ocean's unpredictability. They force observers to consider both practical hazards, storms, shifting cargo, or mechanical failure, and the intangible unknowns, the psychological, environmental, or even anomalous forces that might compel entire crews to vanish without a trace. As such, ships drift through history. They become symbols of unresolved questions and maritime lore, bridging the factual and the mysterious in a manner that continues to captivate sailors, historians, and storytellers alike. Even as years pass and search efforts fade, abandoned merchant ships remain floating enigmas, their decks empty, their stories pressing against a horizon the ocean refuses to yield. Ghost lights over open water. The ocean at night is an indifferent expanse, vast and unbroken, stretching beyond the horizon until sky and water become indistinguishable. Sailors have long described an eerie, almost otherworldly luminescence that appears far from any coastline, a light hovering just above the waves, darting and shifting as if aware of those who watch it. These ghost lights, often likened to lanterns bobbing on invisible currents, have been reported in nearly every ocean from the North Atlantic shipping lanes to the South Pacific trade routes, their presence documented in maritime logs dating back centuries. In 1928, the Coast Guard received a distress call that would become one of the most enigmatic examples of these phenomena, a message sent from a vessel whose crew insisted they were witnessing lights that defied conventional explanation. The vessel, a cargo ship navigating the fog-prone waters off the New England coast, radioed in the early hours of a late October morning. Its captain described spheres of amber and green light hovering over the water, reflecting sharply against the low clouds yet casting no discernible shadow on the sea. Observers on board noted that the lights moved with apparent intelligence, retreating when approached and gathering in patterns that suggested a deliberate formation. At first, the Coast Guard attributed the lights to lighthouses or platforms, but subsequent radio reports conveyed growing urgency. The lights followed the ship, constantly realigning, giving the crew a growing sense of unease. Historical records of similar events corroborate the account. Mariners throughout history have referred to will-o'-the-wisps over water, phenomena often dismissed as optical illusions caused by bioluminescent plankton or the reflection of starlight on fog. A 1926 report from the British Royal Navy described a convoy in the North Sea encountering glowing orbs that appeared to hover above the waves and then vanish instantaneously. These incidents were classified as unexplained due to precise observations from credible witnesses. On the night of the 1928 distress call, the Coast Guard dispatched a cutter to intercept the vessel navigating through heavy fog and turbulent waters. As the crew approached the coordinates given in the message, they too observed faint lights over the waves, though the shapes seemed less defined than the captain had described. Some lights flickered like lanterns, while others moved in sweeping arcs across the horizon. Attempts to illuminate the phenomena with searchlights proved futile. The beams would pass through the lights without altering their trajectory or brightness. Crew logs noted the lights seemed to respond to movements, retreating when approached and circling back afterward. Marine biologists have since suggested several natural explanations. Some point to bioluminescent organisms such as dinoflagellates, which can produce brief flashes of light when disturbed, though these are typically confined to the water's surface rather than hovering in the air. Another theory posits atmospheric refraction of distant lights, which can create mirage-like effects in foggy conditions, though such phenomena rarely display the responsiveness or patterning reported by sailors. Even rare electrical phenomena, like St. Elmo's fire, have been considered. This occurs when atmospheric electricity ionizes the air around a ship's mast or rigging, creating a visible glow, yet none fully explain lights appearing miles offshore, moving deliberately and vanishing without a trace. In the decades following the 1928 incident, similar encounters continued to appear in maritime records. Off the coast of Japan in the 1950s, fishing crews described balls of orange and blue light hovering over the water and moving in unison as though under collective control. In the Gulf of Mexico during the 1960s, multiple oil platform operators reported hovering lights that appeared and disappeared without explanation, sometimes coinciding with equipment malfunctions. These incidents suggest ghost lights may be a genuine but poorly understood maritime phenomenon, challenging conventional physics. Eyewitnesses often describe more than just visual effects. The lights are sometimes accompanied by subtle sounds, like distant bells or the hum of machinery, and sailors report shifts in air temperature or a sudden feeling of stillness, as if the ocean itself has paused in anticipation. In some cases, compasses and navigational instruments behave erratically when ghost lights are nearby, adding an element of hazard to encounters. These reports are often cross-referenced in historical logs, lending credibility to the experiences even when they defy physical explanation. The consistency of these accounts, combined with the authority of trained mariners, has made the phenomenon a subject of serious, if cautious, study within maritime circles. While skeptics argue that stress, fatigue, and the isolation of life at sea can create perceptual distortions, the precision and coordination of multiple eyewitness reports challenge purely psychological explanations. The 1928 Coast Guard logs stand out because they include both a distress call and subsequent verification by a responding cutter. Recorded contemporaneously, the event remains one of the most thoroughly documented encounters, despite no physical samples. Researchers examining the logs note that the light's behaviour, retreating, circling and maintaining distance, suggests a mechanism or intelligence entirely unknown to maritime science. Ghost lights continue to intrigue both scientists and sailors, bridging the line between documented phenomena and the realm of the inexplicable. They serve as reminders of the ocean's vastness and the limits of human perception when confronted with its unknown depths. Modern tracking systems and satellite imagery have yet to fully explain these occurrences, leaving room for speculation and further investigation. From the North Atlantic to the Pacific trade routes, the sightings persist, reported in journals, news articles, and the oral histories of those who navigate the world's most isolated waters. Each account reinforces the same haunting truth. The sea can harbour phenomena that challenge understanding, resisting measurement, capture, and explanation. Even today, modern Coast Guard training includes accounts of historical ghost light sightings, emphasising situational awareness and the need for caution when navigating unfamiliar waters at night. These stories serve as warnings and enigmatic chapters of maritime history, reminding mariners that the ocean holds unexplained mysteries. The 1928 distress call remains a touchstone for researchers and enthusiasts alike, a case in which credible witnesses encountered lights that behaved in ways still defying all conventional explanation. The lights, natural or otherwise, drift across the open water, indifferent to questions, leaving only their fleeting glow as evidence of passage. Sea serpent sightings. In the logs of 17th century Dutch whalers, a shadow stretched across the horizon, described as a twisting, undulating form that defied the scale of any known fish. The sailors recorded its enormous length, its serpentine head rising and falling with the swell of the waves and the wake it left behind, which suggested a creature far larger than the whales they hunted. These early reports were met with skepticism by authorities in port, yet multiple independent sightings within the same season lent credibility to the claims. Sketches included in the logs depicted a sinuous body with humps that broke the surface at intervals, a pattern that would recur in hundreds of subsequent accounts across oceans and centuries. A naval officer off the coast of Norway in 1846 reported a serpent-like creature with a head rising above the waves and a body coiling for hundreds of feet beneath the surface. The officer's log described the creature as moving deliberately, occasionally submerging only to reappear seconds later at a distance that defied any normal estimation. He noted the reaction of his crew, seasoned sailors who'd seen storms, rogue waves, and whales alike, yet all were struck with an unusual fear and fascination. Newspaper reports of the time sensationalized the story, but the original naval records remain preserved, detailing coordinates, estimated dimensions, and the repeated surfacing of the creature, all carefully documented in handwriting that emphasized observation over conjecture. The frigid waters of the North Atlantic have long hosted the most persistent reports, where shipping routes intersect deep trenches and currents capable of concealing enormous unknown life forms. In the Labrador Sea, between Greenland and Newfoundland, vessels have consistently reported long, dark shapes moving beneath the water, sometimes leaving spiraling wakes that stretch for hundreds of meters. Some fishermen claim that the serpentine forms are most visible during fog or heavy seas, conditions that obscure their true size and allow them to approach undetected. Oceanographers studying these regions Note that currents and thermoclines could create illusions of elongation, yet the scale described in multiple sightings surpasses what any optical distortion could reasonably produce. In 1978, sonar readings from a research vessel in the Saraso Sea recorded an object of unprecedented length, moving with deliberate undulations, though no visual confirmation was captured. The sonar operator logged the contact as exceeding 200 feet, with periodic lateral movements suggesting a flexible, elongated body. Attempts to follow the object using the vessel's tracking equipment proved frustrating. It would accelerate or dive beyond the range of detection. At the time, marine biologists consulted to interpret the readings could only hypothesize, citing the possibility of giant squids or misidentified whales, yet even these explanations failed to account for the movement patterns and persistence of the target. The incident remains a reference point for contemporary researchers who catalogue unexplained marine phenomena. Marine biologists acknowledge the existence of giant squids and oarfish, both capable of startling appearances, yet they fall short of explaining accounts of multiple humps, rapid directional shifts, and coordinated movement. The oarfish, sometimes exceeding 30 feet in length, is often suggested as a source for historical sightings, yet it is rarely seen alive near the surface and does not match the repeated surfacing behaviour described by mariners. Giant squids are capable predators, but they inhabit deep waters and are largely solitary, and their presence fails to explain reports of multiple creatures or those seen coiling and circling in patterns suggestive of intelligence. These limitations reinforce the sense that witnesses have encountered something outside known marine biology. Reports consistently describe sudden vanishing acts, as if the creature senses its observation and withdraws into unseen depths, leaving behind only disturbed waters and frightened crews. Sailors describe wakes that ripple for minutes after the last visible trace of the form, as though a massive body slipped below a layer of calm that quickly restores the illusion of emptiness. Some reports include behavioural peculiarities, creatures approaching the bow of a vessel only to retreat when a spotlight is trained on them, or rising from the depths near anchored ships, circling them silently before disappearing into shadowed waters. These patterns suggest a capacity for awareness, though no evidence exists of intelligence in the human sense, leaving only speculation framed by the credibility of trained observers. From sailors' journals to newspapers of the 19th century, the sea serpent became a symbol of nature's unknown, its legend enduring despite skepticism and scientific inquiry. Artists and writers rendered images of massive serpents twisting across waves, their forms exaggerated for effect but rooted in detailed descriptions from mariners. In Japan, reports of the umebozu, a dark towering sea figure capable of capsizing ships, reflect similar cultural impressions of giant unidentifiable marine entities. Even in the Arctic, Inuit legends speak of enormous serpentine creatures inhabiting fjords and offshore channels. Across these varied accounts, the continuity of description, elongated bodies, serpentine motion, sudden disappearance, lends weight to the idea that witnesses observed something real, even if they could not classify it. Even with modern technology probing the oceans, sightings of unexplained serpentine shapes continue to emerge, defying conventional explanation. High-resolution sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and submersible cameras occasionally detect large moving objects that vanish before identification or leave behind disturbances in water columns inconsistent with known species. Some incidents are captured in fleeting images or video, though interpretation remains controversial. Oceanographers caution that while some sightings may be misidentified whales, schools of fish, or floating debris, the consistency of reports over centuries across hemispheres and ocean basins suggests a phenomenon not fully explained by error or imagination. The scale, behaviour and persistence of these sightings challenge understanding, leaving scientists and sailors alike with a shared uncertainty, the possibility that the oceans harbour creatures as vast and elusive as the depths themselves. Each report, whether recorded in a 17th century log or detected by modern instrumentation, reinforces a simple, haunting truth. The sea conceals more than it reveals, and some of its inhabitants may exist beyond the boundaries of human knowledge. Far below the surface, a twisting shadow lingers, leaving questions that no sonar ping or historian's ledger can fully answer. The Saraso Sea anomalies. At the heart of the North Atlantic lies a region defined by its stillness and floating vegetation, where golden mats of sargassum drift in a slow, circular current known as the North Atlantic Gyre. Unlike the roiling waters elsewhere in the ocean, this area can appear deceptively calm, with vast stretches of floating seaweed forming dense carpets that ripple only slightly with the wind. Mariners have noted the striking contrast between the vibrant, almost luminous greenery and the deep blue water beyond, a visual boundary that often signals the start of navigational challenges. Oceanographers have mapped these drifting islands of sargassum, recognizing their role in supporting marine life while also contributing to unusual patterns of surface current, yet historical accounts suggest the sea holds more than botanical significance. In 1592, a merchant vessel bound for England reported being ensnared in a labyrinth of seaweed for weeks, its sails slack and compass needles trembling as if in protest. The captain described attempting to force the ship through dense mats that twisted and piled upon themselves, slowing progress to a crawl. Sailors grew increasingly anxious as days passed without noticeable drift, and repeated attempts to navigate with instruments yielded inconsistent results. Similar accounts appear throughout maritime logs of the 17th and 18th centuries, often with the crew noting sudden disorientation or the perception that the ship had been held in place against natural currents. These reports, though sometimes dismissed as exaggeration, reflect a consistent pattern observed by mariners over centuries. Captains consistently note a disorienting calm within the Saraso Sea, where wind ceases and waves flatten, leaving vessels drifting for days despite the broader currents surrounding them. This phenomenon is particularly pronounced during the summer months, when the subtropical high-pressure system stabilizes surface conditions. Sailors have recorded frustration as small vessels lost headway, appearing anchored though their sails hung limp. Even experienced navigators describe a sensation of suspended time, as if the sea itself were holding them in place. Instruments occasionally behave erratically, compasses wobble without explanation, and chronometers can register subtle but cumulative errors. These anomalies have long contributed to the sea's reputation as a zone of unease and unpredictability. During a 1968 oceanographic survey, researchers observed floating debris and dense algal clusters stretching for miles, creating pockets of near-stagnant water capable of trapping small craft. The study documented concentrations of sargassum that varied seasonally, forming networks that could extend hundreds of square miles. Buoys placed to track surface drift revealed irregular flow patterns within the gyre, including vortices and eddies that slowed movement against prevailing currents. While the survey had no intention of investigating anomalies, the patterns observed correlated with areas historically associated with reports of immobilized ships. Scientific observations confirmed that while the seaweed itself is not sentient, the combination of dense mats and variable currents produces conditions capable of confounding navigation. Sudden compass failures and the inexplicable drift of larger ships cannot be explained by the gyre's rotational forces and the density of floating seaweed alone, oceanographers warn. Magnetic anomalies have been suggested, as certain minerals in the Atlantic seabed may interact subtly with navigational instruments, but no definitive causal link has been established. Optical distortions, created by layers of air with varying temperature and moisture above dense mats, can contribute to illusions of land or ships appearing closer than they are. Yet the recurring theme across centuries of logs and reports is a region where natural explanations, while plausible, leave unresolved questions about the consistency and precision of the effects experienced by mariners. A 1935 Coast Guard report describes a schooner vanishing from radar for 24 hours while traversing the region, only to reappear miles off course, with its crew unable to explain the delay. The vessel's log, maintained by a seasoned captain, notes calm seas and a dense mat of sargassum that slowed progress despite the engine running at full capacity. When the schooner emerged from the drift zone, the crew found their bearings altered. Celestial observations no longer matched expected positions, and they had consumed more provisions than anticipated for the distance travelled. Such incidents, though rare, are supported by multiple corroborating accounts from merchant and naval vessels, reinforcing the sense that the Saraso Sea imposes unusual conditions on ships passing through it. The weeded circle, a zone said to ensnare vessels and time itself, appears in sailors' journals from the 18th century, where even experienced mariners hesitated to sail. Tales describe ships moving in loops or drifting for days without headway, as though held in a subtle current that defies external forces. Some accounts detail the eerie stillness of the sea, punctuated only by the sound of rustling seaweed or the distant cry of birds, fostering a growing sense of isolation among crews. Early navigational manuals, while attempting to provide practical guidance, often included warnings couched in folklore, advising captains to avoid prolonged travel through the densest mats of Sargassum. These cultural markers reflect a blend of observation, superstition, and lived experience that persists in the maritime record. Mapped extensively and observed through modern satellite imagery, the Saraso Sea continues to confound navigation, its currents and vegetation, along with something still unknown, forming an elusive trap. Contemporary vessels report slight but persistent deviations from plotted courses, and remote sensors occasionally record surface drift inconsistent with modelled predictions. Oceanographers remain cautious in attributing these anomalies solely to natural forces, acknowledging the potential for complex interactions between water density, wind, and algal mats. In some cases, minor incidents have escalated into full-scale distress situations, underscoring the continuing challenges faced by mariners in this deceptively tranquil expanse. Ships continue to enter the drifting expanse, and some do not return on the course expected, leaving only the whisper of windless waves and the glint of sun on endless golden mats of seaweed. Submarine Mysteries of the Deep, the USS Nautilus, launched in 1954 as the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, demonstrated that humans could traverse depths and distances once thought impossible, yet the ocean's dark expanse remained largely unconquered. Designed to operate silently beneath the waves for months at a time, it navigated areas that had been previously unreachable, testing both the limits of engineering and human endurance. Despite these advancements, early crews quickly learned that the ocean's hidden depths presented hazards far more complex than pressure, cold, or mechanical failure. From thermoclines that distorted sonar to uncharted trenches that swallowed light, even the most sophisticated vessels encountered conditions that seemed to defy prediction. During the 1960s, patrols beneath the Arctic ice pushed submarines into uncharted waters, where sonar echoes returned shapes that operators could neither identify nor anticipate. Submarines such as the USS Skate and USS Sea Dragon undertook missions that required navigating labyrinthine ice channels and surveying deep trenches, all while maintaining radio silence. Crew members reported occasional sonar readings of enormous moving objects, sometimes mimicking the size or movement of other vessels, before disappearing as quickly as they appeared. These anomalies, recorded in official patrol logs, were treated with caution and, in some cases, quietly archived, their mysterious nature preserved within classified files for decades. In 1968, the USS Scorpion vanished with all hands in the North Atlantic, leaving behind only debris recovered months later, a stark reminder of the ocean's capacity to swallow even advanced vessels. Investigators pieced together fragments of the vessel's hull and personal effects scattered across the seabed, yet no clear explanation emerged for its sudden disappearance. Official reports cited possible mechanical failure or catastrophic flooding, but sonar logs from nearby ships suggested disturbances inconsistent with known hazards, hinting at forces or conditions still poorly understood. The loss of the Scorpion became emblematic of the deep ocean's unpredictability, a warning that technology, no matter how advanced, could be rendered ineffective by unseen circumstances. Sonar operators aboard the USS Thresher in 1963 reported sudden, unexplained readings of massive underwater objects moving at impossible speeds, followed by catastrophic loss of contact. In the hours preceding the incident, crew members had logged sonar returns that seemed to evade tracking, slipping across the seabed at speeds inconsistent with any known marine life or vessel. When the Thresher descended beyond operational depth, communications abruptly ceased, and search efforts later located only scattered debris. Analysts have speculated about equipment malfunction, underwater seismic activity, or extreme thermoclines, yet the repeated pattern of elusive sonar contacts in this and other cases continues to perplex naval historians and oceanographers alike. Nearby naval vessels occasionally recorded shadows on sonar that seemed to follow or evade submarines, prompting crew members to question whether these were natural formations, marine creatures, or something else entirely. During joint exercises in the North Atlantic and Pacific, sonar operators documented brief, massive returns that coincided with abrupt course changes of the submarines themselves. Witnesses described the unsettling sensation of being observed beneath the waves, as if an unknown entity mirrored their movements. Although the objects were never visually confirmed, the consistency of reports across decades suggests that the deep ocean may conceal phenomena capable of interacting with even the most advanced human technology. Specialists studying deep ocean conditions cite underwater currents, thermoclines, and magnetic anomalies as potential explanations for disrupted navigation, though these factors fail to account for repeated patterns observed across different submarines and regions. Submarines navigating near oceanic trenches or seamounts frequently report temporary instrument malfunction or loss of depth control, yet these occurrences do not always correlate with measurable anomalies. Some investigators suggest the presence of unknown topographical or geophysical features that could distort sonar and magnetic readings, while others propose that massive, unclassified biological entities might be responsible for certain disruptions. Despite decades of research, no single explanation has reconciled all historical and contemporary anomalies. A review of multiple cases reveals that disappearances and anomalies often occur along deep trenches near seamounts or in areas of complex bathymetry, suggesting an environmental or unknown phenomenon at work. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, Puerto Rico Trench, and sections of the Philippine Sea are repeatedly cited in naval incident reports, locations where the ocean floor drops abruptly and currents twist unpredictably. Submarines operating in these zones encounter sudden pressure changes, unexplained acoustic phenomena, and fleeting sonar contacts that vanish before verification. The recurrence of these anomalies in specific regions underscores the possibility that the ocean's depths harbour hidden variables beyond the reach of contemporary technology or human understanding. Even with decades of technological advancement, the deep ocean continues to resist full understanding, keeping secrets even the most sophisticated submarines cannot penetrate. Modern nuclear submarines are equipped with inertial navigation, high-resolution sonar, and automated control systems, yet reports of mysterious readings, vanished vessels, and unexplained underwater disturbances persist. These incidents, often documented in declassified military files and corroborated by multiple observers, serve as stark reminders of the ocean's immensity and unpredictability. Each mission into the deep reinforces the awareness that beneath the waves lies a domain where human invention meets the unknown. In crushing darkness and uncharted depths, vessels vanish, leaving only sonar echoes and the haunting possibility that some regions of the ocean are forever beyond human reach. Lost convoys of World War II. The North Atlantic, during the height of World War II, was not merely a battlefield. It was a labyrinth of uncertainty stretching from the icy fjords of Norway to the shadowed waters off Newfoundland. Merchant ships laden with food, fuel, and ammunition crossed these perilous routes in vast formations known as convoys, escorted by destroyers and corvettes that vanished as quickly as they appeared on the horizon. Yet, among the thousands of vessels that set sail, a handful were never seen again, dissolving into the mist without distress signals, wreckage, or survivors to explain their fate. Amid wartime secrecy and the chaos of constant attack, reports of missing convoys often surfaced late and were shrouded in confusion. The Royal Navy recorded at least a dozen instances where entire groups of merchantmen, sometimes accompanied by armed escorts, were marked as unaccounted for. In most cases, post-war analysis attributed the disappearances to U-boat strikes or storms, but several remain unresolved. Convoy PQ-17, for example, became infamous for its devastating losses in 1942. Yet lesser-known routes, such as Convoy HX-231 and the westbound Convoy ONS-154, suffered inexplicable vanishings that defied clear cause. Across wartime archives, fragments of intercepted German communications tell part of the story, but not all. Submarine captains often reported torpedoing specific vessels, yet later examination revealed those same ships had already been declared lost days earlier, far from the reported coordinates. In several cases, both Allied and Axis records failed to align, suggesting either navigational miscalculations or events that occurred outside of ordinary explanation. naval historians studying declassified enigma decrypts still note temporal gaps in convoy tracking, where ships seem to disappear from record mid-transmission, as though their radio presence had been abruptly erased. Recent cross-examinations of Allied and Soviet naval intelligence have uncovered further discrepancies in recorded convoy movements, particularly in the North Atlantic between 1942 and 1944. Analysts comparing decrypted radio logs with contemporary oceanographic data found that several convoys were reported transmitting coordinates hundreds of miles from where atmospheric and geomagnetic conditions would have allowed stable communication. The phenomenon, once attributed to enemy jamming, now appears linked to sporadic magnetic anomalies recorded near Iceland and the Faroe Islands, regions later noted for compass failures and auroral distortion. While no conclusive connection has been established, the evidence suggests that the final signals of certain convoys may have been scattered or refracted through zones of geomagnetic interference, leaving their last known position distorted by the very forces they sailed through. In the decades following the war, oceanographic surveys began rediscovering fragments of these long-missing routes. Sonar imaging across the Labrador Sea and Norwegian basin has revealed sections of wreckage strewn across depths exceeding 3,000 metres, yet few match the configurations or tonnage of the convoys reported lost. Among them, one anomaly stands out: a cluster of ship remains arranged in a near-perfect circle, discovered in 2011 by a Norwegian research expedition. The vessels bore no visible impact damage or signs of explosion. Instruments on board the survey vessel registered brief magnetic disturbances, consistent with residual electrical interference. Weather records of the time add their own layer of intrigue. Many convoys vanished amid conditions that, while severe, were not unprecedented: fog banks thicker than smoke, shifting pressure fronts, and long nights under auroral light. Meteorological logs from Allied command note inexplicable compass errors across several days in March 1943, precisely along the routes of two convoys that never arrived. Pilots flying reconnaissance over the Greenland Sea later described frozen halos in the upper atmosphere and glows that distorted the surface of the ocean. Scientists today consider these effects consistent with geomagnetic storms, but none can account for how entire ships could vanish without debris or distress. Onboard testimonies from other convoys only deepen the puzzle. Survivors from nearby fleets recalled nights when radar screens blanked out for several minutes at a time, leaving the sea eerily silent. Some spoke of seeing distant lights flicker and fade over the horizon, as if vessels had simply fallen away into the dark. A surviving sailor from convoy SC-94, interviewed decades later, claimed that his destroyer detected phantom pings on sonar, echoes of ships that seemed to move, respond, and then vanish, as if swallowed by the depth itself. His account, dismissed as the product of fatigue, remains filed among unexplained incidents in the British Admiralty's post-war reports. Forensic marine researchers have since proposed that natural phenomena, such as methane hydrate eruptions or undersea landslides, could have engulfed vessels rapidly, leaving minimal trace. Others suggest electromagnetic interference from solar storms could have disrupted both navigation and radio communication, sending convoys fatally off course. But these theories do not explain the geometric formations of wreckage or the synchronized loss of entire fleets across separate locations. The more closely investigators examine these disappearances, the more they seem to defy a single narrative, hovering instead between documented tragedy and the realm of the inexplicable. At present, the Atlantic's shipping lanes have long forgotten the silent convoys that vanished amid the roar of war. Each new sonar scan of the ocean floor reveals only fragments: a twisted hull here, a rusted boiler there, while the sea itself preserves what no archive can fully reveal. Decades of research, technological advancement, and cautious speculation have done little to dispel the mystery. For every ship identified, another remains unaccounted for, locked in the depths where light and memory fade alike. Existing between what is documented and what remains unseen, the Atlantic holds fast to coordinates that no one has yet discovered. The ghost fleet of Truk Lagoon. It begins with a silence so complete that even memory seems unable to rise through it. The stillness lies thick as silt, pressed against the bones of ships that once trembled under gunfire. In the dim light below the surface, time no longer advances but hovers, each fragment of steel, each torn length of cable caught between life and ruin. Divers describe the place not as a graveyard, but as a memory that never finished dying. In February 1944, the ocean sky was set alight by more than 500 American aircraft, descending upon the Imperial fortress once thought untouchable. The assault, known as Operation Hailstone, lasted barely 2 days but erased an entire fleet. Japan's defensive stronghold in the Caroline Islands became a cauldron of explosions, with supply ships, cruisers and submarines being struck in quick succession. Fuel tanks ignited, ammunition holds erupted from within, and aircraft still chained to decks were consumed before their engines ever started. The lagoon that had anchored Japan's Pacific Command turned into a burning mirror of oil and flame. When the bombardment ended, what remained drifted downward through the smoke and the silence, settling into a grave that no one would visit for decades. More than 40 vessels and hundreds of aircraft sank within the ring of coral, leaving behind thousands of soldiers and crew. Survivors were few. Witnesses described the surface boiling from heat as ships slipped away beneath it. Then the sea closed, the waves calmed, and the lagoon resumed its deceptive tranquility. It would remain sealed in that quiet for nearly 25 years, the war forgotten beneath a surface that seemed indifferent to its dead. More than 20 years later, when divers finally returned to chart the wrecks, they found an entire fleet waiting in still formation, undisturbed by time. Jacques Cousteau's 1969 expedition brought the first images of what he called a ghost armada, resting intact upon the lagoon floor. Propellers gleamed faintly in the filtered light. Porcelain cups sat unbroken beside typewriters and instruments. Boots lay beside rusted rifles as if their owners had only stepped away. The water, dense with suspended life, muted every sound but the slow hiss of a diver's breath. The sensation, Cousteau wrote, was of entering a dream left unfinished. Marine scientists point to chemistry rather than mystery, noting that the lagoon's stagnant layers create a vault where even corrosion loses its appetite. Warm, shallow water sits above a cooler oxygen pore layer, forming a natural barrier that slows the decay of steel. With little current to scour or displace the wrecks, they remain preserved in eerie precision. Yet, for all the logic, something in the scale of stillness resists explanation. Inside the holds, cargo manifests remain legible. Bottles retain air bubbles trapped since the day of impact. Even bacteria, in some compartments, seem reluctant to begin their work. Those who enter the wrecks describe moments when instruments falter and the light bends strangely, as if the water itself were shifting around them. Divers have reported the sudden dimming of torches, the return of echoes where none should exist, and the faint clatter of metal deeper within the ships. Some claim to hear muffled engines, or the creak of a hull under non-existent strain. While most of these incidents can be dismissed as acoustic reflections or disorientation, dive logs still record them, entries written by professionals who found no technical fault in their gear. The still air trapped inside sealed compartments carries a metallic scent, as though the war lingers in the breath itself. Forensic surveys conducted by Japanese and Micronesian dive teams in the late 20th century revealed how astonishingly complete many of the wrecks remained. Inside officers' quarters, charts still rested on desks, medical kits and logbooks were found unopened, their paper fragile yet legible. Human remains, undisturbed in several compartments, were documented and respectfully left in place under protective oversight. In 2007, corrosion researchers installed long-term sensors to study the chemical environment inside the hulls and discovered fluctuating oxygen levels that rose and fell in rhythm with lunar tides, an anomaly that remains under investigation. Each reading suggested the lagoon itself breathes through its wrecks, as though the fleet has become part of a living, unseen mechanism within the sea. Through the decades, coral has crept across the decks and guns, transforming engines of war into gardens of quiet colour. Lionfish drift through the passageways where officers once walked. Anemones bloom along the barrels of anti-aircraft guns. The contrast between ruin and life has made Truk Lagoon one of the world's most visited underwater museums, a place both celebrated and mourned. Japanese officials have declared it a national war cemetery, while the Federated States of Micronesia regard it as a cultural and environmental sanctuary. Yet the beauty conceals the tragedy too well. Every descent here is also an intrusion into a silence that has not forgotten what caused it. For reasons still debated among researchers, the ships of Truk seem suspended outside of ordinary decay, their clocks forever stopped at the hour the sea took them. Metal samples retrieved in recent years show slower corrosion rates than comparable wrecks elsewhere in the Pacific. Sonar readings occasionally register anomalies, temporary blurs or distortions that seem to shift positions between scans. Some suggest geothermal currents or magnetic irregularities beneath the lagoon, while others note the absence of any geological feature that might explain such readings. Even the coral growth follows a pattern scientists struggle to model, as if the ecosystem itself grows according to a rhythm inherited from that single day in 1944. For those who have seen it, the Ghost Fleet is less a site of discovery than a moment suspended between history and haunting. It is both a natural museum and an underwater tomb, a testament to the endurance of silence. The lagoon, calm under a bright Pacific sun, gives no hint of what lies beneath its surface, yet anyone who descends through its still blue veil speaks of an unmistakable presence, something patient, listening and endlessly aware. The sea lies calm and blue, yet somewhere beneath it, the war still breathes in silence. Spontaneous ship explosions. There are few sounds at sea more haunting than the thunder of an explosion that no one sees coming. Throughout maritime history, ships have vanished in columns of flame so sudden that survivors spoke of light before sound, of a horizon that ignited, then fell silent. These events, scattered across decades and oceans, resist any single explanation. Official records list causes as unknown, while theories stretch from chemical instability to spontaneous combustion born from the ship's own cargo. Yet each case, when revisited, carries details that refuse to settle neatly into reason. The night of June 16, 1960, was clear off the coast of Brazil when the Santos Maru, a Japanese freighter carrying manganese ore and barrels of whale oil, erupted without warning. Witnesses aboard a nearby trawler reported a flash that turned the sea white for an instant, followed by debris raining over half a mile. No SOS was ever transmitted. When salvage teams arrived days later, they found no signs of fire damage on the floating remains, only clean fractures in the steel plates, as if the hull had been torn apart from the inside out. Maritime investigators noted the absence of fuel contamination on the surface, suggesting the explosion's force had somehow consumed its own source. Historical reports of similar incidents trace back further into the steam age, when coal-fired vessels carried another kind of risk. Coal bunkers, when poorly ventilated, could ignite through spontaneous combustion. Yet even in those days, certain explosions defied the mechanics of heat and oxygen. In 1898, the British steamer Mohegan exploded while nearing the Cornish coast, scattering fragments across the waves before sinking in minutes. Divers later found the ship's boilers intact. No evidence of overpressure, no signs of sabotage. Only warped iron bulkheads, as if crushed outward by something more violent than fire. Accounts from World War II intensified the mystery. Dozens of naval and merchant vessels were lost in what records vaguely described as unexplained detonations. Among them was the USS Mount Hood, an ammunition ship anchored in Seadler Harbour in November 1944. The blast destroyed every vessel within a 2,000-foot radius, leaving a crater on the ocean floor. The heat was so immense that steel beams fused into glass. The cause was never conclusively determined. The surviving witnesses, those stationed on nearby ships, described seeing a single vertical column of light before the air itself seemed to ignite. In the years following the war, as shipping expanded and synthetic chemicals became common cargo, the number of such incidents declined but never disappeared. The MV Dona Paz, which exploded in 1987 in the Tablas Strait of the Philippines, was officially attributed to a collision with an oil tanker. Yet reports from coastal villages described two separate fireballs, one far larger than any collision could explain, and a concussive wave that registered on seismographs hundreds of miles away. The oil tanker's cargo, inspectors later found, was insufficient to generate that scale of destruction. Research into maritime explosions has since entered the realm of materials science. Chemical engineers studying residual compounds from shipwrecks note the possibility of gas accumulations, methane, hydrogen sulfide or acetylene, formed by reactions between seawater and corroded metal. These gases, trapped in sealed compartments, could ignite with minute static charges. Yet even this explanation fails to account for the frequency of explosions reported in calm seas on ships with no known leaks or corrosion. The phenomenon appears selective, occurring without discernible pattern or environmental trigger. Elsewhere in the Atlantic, researchers investigating the 1918 disappearance of the USS Cyclops have drawn parallels to modern explosion events. Though the ship was never found, a sister vessel, the Proteus, vanished under similar conditions in 1941. Both carried manganese ore, the same mineral that fueled the Santos Maru's final voyage. Metallurgists have since speculated that, under extreme humidity, certain ore combinations could release combustible gases through electrochemical reaction. But field tests have yielded only partial results: tiny sparks where theory predicted flame, silence where destruction once occurred. One often overlooked case occurred in 1939, involving the SS Kamloops, a Chinese passenger steamer that exploded near the mouth of the Huangpu River. Estimates of the dead range from 2,000 to 4,000, making it one of the worst maritime disasters in history. The official cause, mine detonation, was never confirmed, and divers who examined the wreck noted the keel had split from within, not below. Chinese naval historians still debate whether the ship's cargo, reported to include chemicals confiscated from military stockpiles, could have undergone an unstable reaction, or whether something more anomalous was at play in the brackish currents where it sank. Patterns began to emerge when maritime archives were digitized in the early 2000s. Data analysts noticed that the majority of spontaneous ship explosions occurred along ancient trade routes, lanes once used for the transport of volatile materials like whale oil, nitrates and coal tar. Curiously, several modern incidents happen near or directly above known wreck sites from earlier centuries, suggesting a possible link between seabed chemistry and atmospheric ignition. In certain regions, like the Bay of Bengal and the South China Sea, satellite sensors have even detected faint methane flares coinciding with ship disappearances, yet none have been observed in real time. Another layer of mystery surrounds the accounts of survivors. In rare cases where explosions did not sink the ship entirely, crews reported an identical prelude, a deep hum or vibration running through the hull moments before detonation. Some likened it to the resonance of struck metal, others to an electrical charge rippling through the air. Instrumentation logs from surviving vessels record sudden magnetic fluctuations, brief but measurable, immediately before the blast. Scientists have considered piezoelectric effects, undersea gas plumes, and even electromagnetic anomalies, but no conclusive mechanism has been demonstrated in controlled environments. Some draw parallels between these maritime explosions and a lesser-known atmospheric phenomenon: transient luminous events, flashes of light occurring above thunderstorms in the upper atmosphere. Physicists studying sprites and blue jets have suggested that similar plasma discharges might occur near the ocean surface under rare electrical conditions. If so, these would be invisible until contact with conductive material, like a steel hull, triggered a catastrophic release of energy. Such a theory, while speculative, aligns eerily with descriptions of the Mount Hood and Santos Maru incidents: instantaneous, vertical, and consuming. Few other mysteries have resisted inquiry as completely as this one. From the first coal-fired steamer to the last oil freighter, lost to inexplicable combustion, the pattern persists in defiance of modern understanding. Maritime archives continue to collect reports of explosions, often dismissed as maintenance errors or overlooked in favour of simpler explanations. Yet each investigation, when revisited decades later, reveals the same absences, the same missing spark, the same impossible sequence. Each time another ship vanishes in fire, the question returns: not how it happened, but why it keeps happening still. The Azor's Triangle anomalies. Navigational instruments have long behaved strangely near the Azores, their needles wavering without a magnetic cause. Sailors describe compasses that drift off true north by degrees, only to correct themselves moments later. Pilots crossing the corridor report brief intervals of radio silence, though their equipment shows no fault. The anomalies are subtle, rarely dramatic, but persistent enough to enter maritime record books, where incident after incident repeats a common phrase: unexplained deviation. Even now, digital instruments occasionally flicker across the same coordinates, as if the atmosphere itself were distorting the concept of direction. At the meeting point of immense tectonic plates, the Azores mark a place where the Earth's crust fractures and reforms without rest. Here, the North American, Eurasian and African plates meet in constant motion, creating deep ridges and volcanic vents that shape the archipelago above. The islands rise from a submerged plateau of basaltic rock, surrounded by fault lines that stretch for hundreds of kilometres. Scientists from the Portuguese Institute for Sea and Atmosphere have documented recurring seismic tremors that pulse through the seabed at irregular intervals, tiny but measurable, like the slow heartbeat of the Atlantic itself. The combination of heat, pressure, and shifting polarity forms a natural laboratory for both geological study and unexplained phenomena. Centuries before satellite navigation, Portuguese explorers noted erratic compass bearings and sudden fogs that obscured the stars. In the early 1500s, ships travelling from Lisbon to the Caribbean sometimes reported floating clouds that clung to the sea's surface, dimming even the brightest constellations. One log from 1538 describes a night when the crew of the São João saw the horizon bend downward as if the sky were folding into the ocean. Mariners attributed such distortions to the supernatural, believing the area to be guarded by unseen forces. Yet their routes continued to cross these waters, and their charts, dense with speculative symbols, became the first to mark the region's uncertain reputation. Naval archives from the 1940s record the unexplained disappearance of patrol aircraft and weather reconnaissance planes near these coordinates. One such case involved a British Lockheed Hudson that vanished without distress transmission while operating between the Azores and Gibraltar. Another entry, dated 1943, mentions a US Navy escort ship that went off radar for nearly 2 hours, only to reappear on course with its instruments reset and its chronometers showing a discrepancy of 12 minutes. Crew statements described a dense, luminous fog and the sensation of slowed time. Though wartime secrecy and incomplete documentation obscure the details, both Allied and Axis records confirm irregular communications and untraceable radar echoes from the Central Atlantic during that period. Modern research vessels equipped with magnetic and seismic sensors continue to register inexplicable variations in the surrounding field. Oceanographers mapping the mid-Atlantic ridge have encountered zones where sonar signals bend, producing blurred returns as though the sea itself were refracting them. In 2011, a European marine geophysics team detected fluctuating magnetic polarity within a circular area north of São Miguel. The readings oscillated too rapidly for ordinary geological explanation. The instruments recalibrated repeatedly, each time producing a slightly different map of the same seafloor. The researchers published their findings as temporary magnetic inversion events. But even that phrasing, cautious and scientific, left open the question of how an entire magnetic field could appear to pulse. Divers operating off Pico and Terceira have filmed geometric stone formations arranged in deliberate symmetry. The structures, rectangular blocks forming corridors and right angles, were first brought to public attention in 2013 by independent exploration teams. Measurements suggest the formations lie nearly 40 metres below sea level, positioned on an ancient shelf that predates known human habitation of the islands. Geological surveys describe the shapes as volcanic in origin, but others note tool-like precision. Portuguese maritime historians have speculated about pre-glacial cultures lost to sea level rise, though no evidence links these formations to any confirmed civilization. The stones remain unmapped by official authorities, their origins, whether natural or engineered, unverified. Pilots crossing the Azorian corridor have reported visual distortions, light bending, false horizons, and sudden optical reflections. In 1978, a Transavia flight en route from Boston to Lisbon experienced a shimmering reflection on the sea's surface that mimicked a second sky. The pilots later described the illusion as a perfect mirror of clouds beneath the aircraft, moving independently from the ocean. Weather records confirmed calm conditions, with no atmospheric inversion capable of producing such a reflection. Similar accounts have surfaced from cargo ship crews who, at dusk, witness ghostly outlines of vessels that fade when approached. These apparitions, often mistaken for mirages, occur most frequently in a triangular span of water west of the Azores, an area some modern researchers quietly refer to as the Atlantic's silent mirror. Scientific interpretation remains divided between geological tension and atmospheric interference, with no consensus on their interaction. Some physicists attribute the anomalies to fluctuating gravitational gradients caused by tectonic activity beneath the seafloor. Others point to temperature inversion layers and methane release, altering light and sound propagation through the atmosphere. In 2019, magnetometers aboard a European Space Agency satellite recorded irregular spikes in the magnetic field directly over the Azores plateau, distinct from both the African and mid-Atlantic anomalies. Though these readings are publicly archived, their origin remains unexplained, neither solar nor terrestrial in behaviour. The pattern persists, a data anomaly that mirrors the navigational uncertainty below. Azorian sailors speak quietly of the Mar das Sombras, the Sea of Shadows, where voices echo through fog long after ships are gone. Fishermen tell of hearing distant engines that never appear, or bells that toll from nowhere on calm nights. Older generations claim that the sea around Graciosa hums during certain lunar phases, a resonance said to foretell storms. Though modern equipment registers no sound, the stories continue, blending seamlessly with the island's Catholic traditions and maritime superstition. Each tale serves as a caution. In these waters, perception is unreliable, and what appears empty may only be unseen. Every investigation into the region's behaviour ends the same way, with readings that refuse repetition, as though the instruments themselves forget. Scientists continue to measure, record and debate, yet the anomalies persist without pattern or cause. The Azores remain a crossroads of shifting plates and uncertain magnetism, a place where both matter and meaning seem temporarily unanchored. For centuries, navigators have crossed this ocean and emerged with questions that grow more complex each time they return. In that quiet space between magnetic drift and memory, something unseen continues to rewrite its own coordinates. Disappearing sailors at sea. Morning patrols have often sighted them drifting in silence, vessels intact yet emptied of purpose. From the surface they appear unharmed, masts upright, hulls unbroken, sails still answering the wind. But a closer approach reveals something far stranger. No footsteps on the deck, no voices from within the cabins, and no trace of the men who once guided them. Throughout maritime history, such encounters have left even the most seasoned sailors uneasy, as if the ocean itself occasionally swallows its own witnesses, leaving only the instruments of their labour behind. When the brigantine Mary Celeste was found adrift in 1872, her sails hung loose and her cargo untouched. Discovered by the DEI Gratia near the Azores, the ship appeared seaworthy, supplies intact, cargo of industrial alcohol unspilled, and no signs of violence or storm damage. The captain's log ended abruptly 10 days prior, the lifeboat gone, and the crew of 10 vanished without a trace. The last recorded entry described calm seas and normal operations, which only deepened the mystery. What could compel a disciplined captain and his crew to abandon a sound vessel mid-Atlantic? The unanswered question followed the ship long after it was towed to Gibraltar, its decks still smelling faintly of salt wood and something unknowable. Through different centuries, the same pattern has surfaced, seaworthy vessels found devoid of life yet marked by no distress. The Caroleum. Deering, discovered in 1921 aground on Diamond Shoals, mirrored the same chilling emptiness. The galley showed half-prepared food, personal belongings lay untouched, and the lifeboats were missing. In 2007, the Cas 2, a modern Australian catamaran, was found adrift near the Great Barrier Reef. A meal was set on the table, laptops running, and a folded newspaper still on deck. The 3 men who had set sail days before were gone. Their radio was working and their life jackets untouched. Such cases, divided by decades and oceans, echo each other in impossible precision, ships perfectly alive but utterly alone. In the aftermath of what the ocean abandons, forensic reports attempt to restore order. Naval investigations of the Mary Celeste and Deering drew maps of possible routes, speculated on mutiny, piracy, and even gas explosions. Experts studied logs, cargo manifests, and ocean currents, searching for an explanation buried in mathematics or weather. Yet each theory frayed under scrutiny. The Mary Celeste showed no signs of struggle or intoxication from her cargo fumes. The Deering's distress signals were never sighted despite heavy maritime traffic, and the Cas 2's navigation data ended mid-course, as if the voyage simply ceased to exist. These inquiries, meant to illuminate, often only sharpened the darkness surrounding the disappearances. Life at sea demands endurance that borders on the unnatural, and some believe these vanishings began in the mind before they reached the water. Months of confinement on open decks, the endless repetition of horizon and sky, and the disorienting rhythm of isolation can distort perception. Maritime psychologists note how the combination of sleep deprivation, monotony and fear can create momentary delusions or panic decisions, an imagined storm, a false sighting of land, or a collective impulse to flee a vessel for safety that does not exist. Perhaps some crews, pushed past endurance, chose escape over reason, but this too feels partial, unable to account for the precision and silence with which they vanished. Wartime vessels found adrift and unmanned, yet eerily intact, appear throughout naval archives, scattered reports of ships floating for days or weeks after battle. One of the most striking is the case of the USS Cyclops, a US Navy collier that disappeared in March 1918, with 309 men aboard while en route from Barbados to Baltimore. No distress signal was sent and no wreckage was ever recovered, despite extensive searches along her expected route. Her disappearance within the region, later dubbed the Bermuda Triangle, gave rise to decades of speculation. But the Cyclops' size and naval discipline made her loss particularly haunting. Historians cite overloaded cargo or structural failure. Others note the absence of radio calls, suggesting something far swifter and more absolute. The ship's name remains carved into memorial walls, but the ocean never returned her story. Even in the age of GPS and instant communication, vessels still emerge unmanned, their decks glistening under sun or storm as if time had paused. In 2018, fishermen off the coast of the Philippines found a drifting yacht containing a single mummified sailor, the radio still on and the logbook still open. In 2021, a ghost ship was discovered near Japan's Oga Peninsula, its hull scarred by time, its origin uncertain. Authorities traced its markings to a North Korean fishing fleet, one of many lost to the winter currents that sweep between the islands. These modern discoveries prove that the phenomenon is not a relic or legend. It persists, adapting to technology, evading explanation as persistently as before. In the narrow divide between maritime science and legend, a silence persists beyond measure. Sailors have long spoken of places where compasses falter, of sudden fogs that erase distance and direction, of seas that seem to listen. Others suggest invisible threats, pockets of methane gas capable of capsizing boats without warning, rogue waves that appear from flat seas, or sudden drops in air pressure that mimic a storm's panic. Yet none of these fit perfectly, and so the disappearances linger in a liminal space between cause and myth. To some, the sea's vastness itself becomes the explanation, a force too ancient and complex for consistent human comprehension. Each recovered ship becomes a monument to absence, its timbers echoing a question no logbook has ever answered. In maritime museums, preserved hulls like the Mary Celeste's replica and Deering's fragments stand not only as artifacts of history, but as reminders of its unfinished pages. To walk their decks is to sense the residue of command shouted into the wind, of meals half-eaten, of maps rolled and left without destination. No sound remains, only the geometry of loss, and still the ocean continues its quiet accounting, patient, immense and unspeaking. Beyond the horizon, the sea remembers quietly, keeping its own tally of those it claimed and never gave back to the world. Cyclone that swallowed HMS Viper. Long before the first distress call, the air above the North Atlantic had begun to change. Barometers and coastal stations dipped unevenly, and the horizon gathered a dull metallic haze that sailors recognized but could not name. Winds shifted without direction, moving as if drawn by unseen contours. No charts existed to explain the erratic pressure lines between the Bay of Biscay and the English Channel, only sailors' intuition as the sky darkened in unnatural shades of blue and ash. In that quiet before the gale, an entire coastline seemed to pause, as if sensing something vast but unrecorded pressing toward it. Among the vessels testing Britain's new generation of turbine power, HMS Viper stood as both promise and experiment. Commissioned in 1900, she was one of the first Royal Navy destroyers driven entirely by steam turbines, capable of unprecedented speed, over 30 knots during trials. Her design represented the shift from coal-fed reliability to mechanical innovation, a leap forward in naval warfare. Yet, with such progress came uncertainty. Her engines demanded precision, and her steel hull had little tolerance for stress. The Viper was both symbol and trial, a feat of engineering that had not yet learned its limits. When she departed for fleet exercises off Alderney in August 1901, her officers had no reason to suspect that nature itself would become their most implacable adversary. In her final log, routine entries gave no hint of what was approaching. Morning weather was fair with moderate seas and scattered clouds, identical to every other ship's report. By afternoon, signals between ships grew faint, distorted by static interference. Witnesses later recalled a dense horizontal fog moving at unnatural speed, flattening the waves and muting sound. Then came the sudden collapse of visibility. A burst of wind struck the destroyer flotilla without warning, scattering them in all directions. Viper, with her untested propulsion and narrow hull, was seen accelerating toward the storm's wall as if drawn into its centre. Moments later, her silhouette vanished entirely. Weather records from August 1901 reveal a pressure system that moved unlike any known Atlantic cyclone of its era. Contemporary charts show its formation too far north, with a rotation inconsistent with standard meteorological models. Barometric readings from Guernsey and Portland Bill differed beyond what distance could explain. The Admiralty's Meteorological Department would later note that the storm's rotation speed exceeded the data limits of early instruments, producing gaps, blank intervals, where readings should have been. To early 20th century science, such inconsistencies were statistical anomalies. To those who had watched the Viper vanish, they were evidence that something more than air and water had moved across the channel that day. Witnesses from a collier east of the channel later described a phenomenon no barometer could explain. According to their report, the sky above the storm did not darken, but instead glowed pale white, as though illuminated from within the vapour. A single flash, silent, not lightning, briefly revealed what they took for the outline of a ship rising at a steep angle before being consumed by mist. When the air cleared 2 hours later, the sea was calm, the wind gone, and no trace of debris or oil remained. Investigators dismissed the account as an illusion born of shock, but similar descriptions appear in 3 independent logbooks from vessels positioned miles apart. Each referenced the same white radiance, a momentary stillness, and an impression that the storm had folded inward on itself before dissipating. For investigators reviewing the Viper's loss, absence became its own form of evidence. Divers scoured the waters near Alderney for months, guided by drift calculations and surface patterns. Not a fragment of her hull, not a lifebuoy was ever retrieved. The Board of Inquiry at Portsmouth concluded the ship had struck submerged rocks, an explanation that satisfied procedure but not probability. The destroyer's reinforced keel and double plating were designed precisely for shallow water resilience. Privately, some officers wondered if violent pressure changes had caused an implosion rather than an impact, a collapse from within rather than without. The theory remained untested, as the sea offered nothing back. In later years, naval meteorologists found echoes of that same pressure pattern in storms decades apart. A 1939 cyclone off the Azores showed identical barometric irregularities, forming voids on weather charts where readings vanished. Pilots flying reconnaissance described sudden radio silence, as though atmospheric density itself swallowed transmission. By the 1950s, better equipment recorded similar anomalies, though explanations grew more clinical: microbursts, downdrafts, or magnetospheric interference. Yet each time data vanished mid-recording, the archived reports made a quiet note of what sailors had once described in simpler terms: a storm that moved as though it were alive. Accounts from local islanders add another layer, one that the Admiralty never entered into its files. Fishermen off Guernsey claimed faint mechanical sounds could be heard beneath the surf for several nights, an intermittent hum like turbines winding down. Others swore they saw pale lights beneath the waves that followed their boats before fading into darkness. Though dismissed as echoes or planktonic light, the stories persisted for years, whispered with quiet respect. Even decades later, when wreckage from other lost destroyers surfaced, none bore the name Viper, as if the sea had deliberately withheld this one ship from its usual ritual of return. Modern researchers revisiting the Viper's disappearance treat it as both a meteorological puzzle and a cautionary tale. Simulations suggest her turbine engines at full power in turbulent crosswinds could have caused catastrophic cavitation. Pressure voids that destabilized the hull. Others propose that the cyclone structure may have resembled a rare atmospheric vortex known today as a mesocyclone, capable of producing rapid waterspouts exceeding 100 meters wide. Either theory explains the ship's vulnerability, but neither clarifies the absence of wreckage or bodies. Every analysis returns to the same impasse. Recorded data ends abruptly, as if nature itself erased the line. Historians now view the Viper as a symbol of technological hubris, meeting elemental indifference. She embodied the optimism of a navy entering the modern age, undone not by war or failure, but by a force no instrument could measure. In an era before satellite tracking or weather radar, her disappearance marked a boundary between what could be built and what could be understood. The storm that took her was never named, its coordinates left vague, as if omission might dull its memory. Some storms take what they need, and in that brief exchange between sea and sky, no trace is meant to remain. Phantom anchors and dragging chains. On nights when the sea holds its breath, sailors speak of a faint metallic rhythm beneath the hull, as if some forgotten anchor were being drawn through the deep. The sound is described as distant yet deliberate, like iron links grinding across stone far below. It fades when the wind rises but returns when the ocean stills, steady as a hidden pulse. Those who have heard it say it feels less like a sound of the sea and more like something the sea remembers. In ship's logs from the early 19th century, a pattern emerges. Anchors moving without cause, chains trembling against calm water. Reports span the Caribbean, North Atlantic, and Mediterranean, far from currents strong enough to disturb the seabed. The phenomenon has been noted by merchant captains, naval officers, and fishermen alike. The conditions vary, but the core detail does not. The motion of metal against the deep, heard in absolute stillness. One of the earliest recorded incidents occurred in 1838 aboard the British survey ship Beagle II, while charting reefs off Cape Verde. The log notes that during a night of total calm, the anchor chain vibrated as though drawn by a living force, producing a clatter that lasted nearly half an hour. Soundings taken the next morning showed no change in depth or bottom composition. The commander dismissed it as resonance through the hull, though none could explain what had initiated it. A similar case was reported in 1912 by the crew of the SS Araluen near the Azores. The ship had anchored overnight for maintenance, but at dawn the anchor was found displaced more than half a nautical mile away. The captain's entry described the chain as heaving against itself, despite the mirror-flat surface of the sea. The Royal Maritime inquiry that followed found no mechanical fault, no current of unusual strength, and no record of submarine activity in the region. The final note in the report read only, "Unresolved, likely subsurface instability." Oceanographers have long debated such explanations. Under certain conditions, the seabed can shift like a living thing, slow, silent slides caused by the movement of saturated sediment. Known as liquefaction events, these shifts can cause anchors to slip from their positions without leaving visible drag marks. Yet these occur primarily along unstable slopes or continental margins. Many of the most detailed reports, however, came from tranquil lagoons or deep anchorages resting on compact sand, where no such geological movement was likely. During the early 1960s, researchers studying deep ocean acoustics began to notice something stranger. Hydrophone data from across the Atlantic recorded recurring metallic frequencies, low, resonant tones repeating at irregular intervals. Some were traced to seismic activity, but others seemed to originate from fixed depths where no geological process could account for them. Naval analysts referred to these as iron harmonics, a term quietly noted in classified reports before the data was archived. Sound in the ocean behaves like a ghost. It travels 5 times faster than in air, bending with temperature and pressure until one sound splits into many. In deep water, density layers can trap and redirect sound for hundreds of miles, making distant impacts seem near. The human ear, confined to the hull, interprets these distortions as localized movement, as if the noise were coming from directly underfoot. To sailors adrift in vast silence, such illusions can feel deeply personal, even supernatural. The mystery deepens with accounts from submariners. During World War II, U-boat crews recorded mechanical drumming, reverberating through their hulls like heavy chains clattering. Believing it to be an enemy vessel, captains ordered evasive dives, yet sonar revealed nothing. Post-war naval archives confirm that several Allied submarines encountered similar unexplained metallic patterns. Some modern historians suggest these could have been the echoes of old wreckage shifting on the seabed, though the synchronized timing between distant vessels remains unexplained. Maritime folklore, as always, filled the silence left by science. In Scandinavian legend, sailors told of the Skjolta anchor, the hidden anchor, said to belong to a ghost ship eternally circling beneath the waves. In Portuguese fishing communities, it was called as Correntes das Almas, the chains of souls, marking the graves of lost mariners. The stories warned that to hear the dragging sound was to be sailing over a place the sea had already claimed. But even modern technology has not silenced the legend. In 2017, a British research vessel operating in the South Atlantic recorded a sequence of deep, metallic pulses emanating from nearly 2 kilometers below the surface. The pattern repeated at exact intervals, as though part of a mechanism. Engineers ruled out interference from the ship's systems. Nearby buoys confirmed the signal originated from a stationary point, consistent with the resting site of several unidentified wrecks. The sound ceased abruptly after 48 hours and was never detected again. Other contemporary incidents have been tied to abandoned infrastructure, lengths of submerged cable, remnants of anchors, or lost trawl gear that shift with undercurrents. Yet hydroacoustic analysis often fails to match the recorded frequencies with any known materials. Some suggest the noises are caused by singing sand, a rare phenomenon where compact grains vibrate under pressure, producing low, resonant tones that can mimic metallic reverberation. The idea remains speculative, its occurrence at sea unverified. Psychologists studying maritime isolation note another pattern. Prolonged exposure to repetitive oceanic sounds can create auditory pareidolia, where the brain imposes structure or rhythm on random noise. For sailors spending weeks adrift in monotony, even the creak of a hull can transform into a deliberate pattern. And yet, in the surviving testimonies, these experiences share uncanny precision. The same duration, the same metallic cadence, the same inexplicable stillness of the sea. In maritime museums today, a few recovered anchor chains bear peculiar marks, evenly spaced abrasions that do not align with their original fittings. Curators attribute them to corrosion or improper retrieval, but their symmetry has drawn quiet curiosity. These relics, silent now behind glass, stand as tangible echoes of a phenomenon that remains only half understood. Each account, from the trembling chains of the Beagle II to the hydrophones of the modern ocean, forms part of a single refrain. Whether born of physics, memory, or myth, something beneath the surface continues to move with purpose. It drags unseen across the seabed, repeating a motion no storm or current explains, and when the sea falls silent enough, the sound begins again, a slow, measured rhythm, like an anchor still searching for a place to rest. The ship that heard voices. Sound carries differently at sea, and it moves through fog, along steel hulls, and across empty horizons where no other sound exists. Long before sonar and satellites, mariners trusted the air itself to bring them the only proof that someone else was out there. A voice, a signal, a single coded word that could mean survival or loss. Yet in rare moments, the airwaves spoke without reason, and the ocean's silence was broken by voices that no one had sent. In the early decades of the 20th century, when radio first bridged distances once thought unreachable, ships became part of a growing network of invisible communication. Every message that crossed the static carried the rhythm of human presence, Morse pulses, distress codes, faint fragments of speech distorted by wind and current. Early radio officers often described the sense of listening into an endless void, where sound had no clear direction and no guarantee of origin. Among them, a handful began to document signals that appeared long after their sources had ceased to exist. The transmissions that troubled the Marigold began without warning. She was a British merchant steamer operating in the North Atlantic in 1924, a time when the ocean was still recovering from the wreckage of war, and the wireless bands remained crowded with stray calls. On calm nights, the ship's operators heard faint distress messages repeating the old SOS pattern, but their instruments showed no nearby source. The frequency drifted in and out like a whisper caught in a gale, carrying names and call signs that matched vessels lost years before. Operators kept transcripts of the messages, and some survive in naval archives. They describe an unidentified male voice repeating "engines flooded, position unknown," followed by static and the faint toll of what sounded like a bell. Another entry lists the voice identifying a ship, the Vandalia, sunk off the Azores in 1919, with coordinates corresponding to her last known transmission. The Marigold's crew dismissed it at first as an atmospheric echo, a radio reflection returning from the ionosphere. Yet when they attempted to respond, the signal faded mid-sentence, as if the sender had realised he had been heard. Skeptics blamed interference from military frequencies. The British Admiralty was conducting wireless tests during that same period, and cross-channel distortions were known to cause overlapping messages. But the Marigold's log shows that the signals occurred in intervals that matched the anniversaries of known sinkings, often repeating precise distress words from ships confirmed lost. The radio officer, a veteran named Alfred Morley, wrote in his private notes that the same call letters reappeared weeks later, this time answering his own call with the words, "We see your light." Others noticed that the voices repeated phrases used in distress calls from ships decades older than the Marigold herself. One transcript mirrors a 1893 Morse pattern known from the wreck of the Noronic, a white Starline freighter that vanished without a trace between Liverpool and New York. The same words, loss of boats, loss of hope, appear in the Marigold's wireless logs 30 years later. At the time, newspapers dismissed the connection as a coincidence, but naval engineers found no technical explanation for the signal strength recorded so far from any transmission point. By the time the ship reached port, the recordings were already missing. The operator's cylinder reels, which had been marked for investigation, were reportedly misplaced before the Admiralty could review them. Crew accounts suggest that officers were instructed to avoid discussion of the incident, citing concerns about morale and wartime secrecy. The Marigold continued service for another 3 years before disappearing off Cape Farewell in a violent storm. No trace of her was ever recovered. Because the transmissions were never formally concluded, later accounts from passing vessels claimed they continued faintly, as if adrift in the ether. A Norwegian weather ship in 1952 reported receiving an SOS from a vessel bearing the Marigold's identification code, 28 years after her disappearance. The signal was strong but directionless, vanishing before coordinates could be established. Similar cases appeared sporadically through the 1960s, when commercial radio operators occasionally logged distress signals from names long stricken from registry lists. Many assumed they were fragments of rebroadcast frequencies bouncing off the ionosphere, an unexplained echo of time itself. The signals still come, faint, brief, and gone before anyone can find where they begin. A handful of recordings circulate among amateur enthusiasts, murmured transmissions with clipped English phrasing and distorted static. The International Maritime Organization attributes these to electrical interference, reflections from polar storms, or deliberate hoaxes. But others note that some of these voices use call signs retired more than a century ago, repeating distress codes that have not been in use since before the Second World War. Researchers studying atmospheric resonance have suggested that the ocean itself may play a role in preserving certain radio frequencies. Seawater, especially under extreme pressure, can trap and reflect low-frequency sound waves over vast distances. In theory, signals could resurface years later, distorted and fragmented as the planet's magnetic conditions shift. Yet even that theory cannot explain the presence of human voices, identified words, and names of ships whose records had already ended in tragedy. Others look instead to the psychology of those who listen. The isolation of long voyages, the endless drone of the sea, and the knowledge of unseen wrecks below create a state where imagination can merge with sound. In those conditions, a brief surge of static might take on meaning, and a half-heard pattern can resemble a cry for help. But when multiple operators across separate ships record the same sequence, the question becomes less about perception and more about what lingers in the air. Unlike light, sound leaves no visible trace, lingering for seconds or centuries depending on what carries it, and the ocean stands as Earth's most intricate resonator. The first generation of radio officers who work those frequencies is long gone, but their logs remain, pages of coded fragments that seem to speak across decades. Perhaps what they heard was only interference, or perhaps it was something older than technology itself, something that waits for a listener. Some say the voices never stopped calling, they simply changed the frequency. whistling waves of Cape Cod. It isn't always the wind that people hear. On certain nights, a thin, eerie note rises from the ocean, wavering and hollow, cutting across the fog with a precision no natural gust could achieve. Sailors have described it as a sound both near and impossibly distant, as if the sea itself were producing tones meant for ears that do not exist yet. The whistling slips through hulls, lingers along the rigging and disappears without a trace, leaving only unease in its wake. Some describe the experience as a low, vibrating hum that moves through the body, registering not just in the ears but in the chest, producing a disquiet that lingers long after the sound vanishes. Early mariners, still learning the temperament of the North Atlantic, wrote of nights when the air itself seemed to sing. Lighthouse logs from the 19th century describe evenings when fog and tide combined to carry strange sounds over Cape Cod Bay. Officers of the US Lifesaving Service noted that even in calm weather, a whistling tone would precede storms or accompany the distant echo of waves crashing against shoals. Local newspapers sometimes reported the sound as the morning tide, associating it with lives lost in wrecks along the shifting sands and rocky reefs. In certain entries, the tone is described as rising and falling like a voice, almost human in cadence, sometimes accompanied by the faint sound of bells from lighthouses miles away, suggesting an acoustic interplay between natural resonance and the structures themselves. When the age of measurement arrived, microphones and sonar buoys only deepened the confusion. In the 1950s, researchers from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution attempted to record and analyse the acoustic anomalies. Instruments captured intermittent subharmonic tones and low-frequency vibrations travelling miles from their suspected sources. Yet none of the recordings matched the description left in historical logs. Every measurement suggested a natural origin, trapped air, breaking waves, or pressure gradients, but the pattern of the whistling remained inexplicably deliberate. One experiment attempted to map the source using triangulation with multiple hydrophones. Signals appeared simultaneously in different locations, as if the ocean itself were producing a sound larger than any single point could explain. Those who have heard it describe the same unease, a sound too steady to be wind, too hollow to be human. Night fishermen speak of their boats suddenly vibrating in tune with the pitch, lines slackening or tightening without cause. Coast Guard patrols recall instruments failing when the sound passed overhead, radios filling with static pulses that mimic the whistling's rhythm. Residents living near Race Point have reported standing on dunes, hearing the note rise and fall like a warning, even when all else is still. One entry in a 1968 Coast Guard log notes that the sound persisted for nearly 40 minutes, disappearing only after the tide shifted, leaving the crew unsettled and the compasses spinning with no explanation. Physicists suggested trapped air columns beneath the continental shelf. Internal waves, tidal forces, and varying temperature layers can produce infrasonic vibrations capable of travelling vast distances and sometimes appearing disembodied. Meteorologists proposed atmospheric ducting as another possible explanation, allowing sound waves to bend over the horizon and reach ears far beyond their origin. Yet no combination of known physical phenomena could account for the specific harmonics and irregular pauses described by eyewitnesses, nor for the way the sound often preceded sudden fog or shifting tidal currents. Some studies even noted that the sound seems to carry better over calm, glassy water than during storms, defying expectations for both natural resonance and ducting theories. In the fishing towns along Massachusetts Bay, the explanations took other forms. Stories passed down from lighthouse keepers and mariners describe a spectral presence in the fog, a voice warning of reefs or unseen tides. They called it the singing sea or the keeper's call, linking the sound to ships lost and lives claimed along the Cape's shifting sands. Folktales speak of sailors being drawn toward the sound, lured dangerously close to shoals, only to escape by chance or through instinct. Historical records note that the whistling was often cited in accounts of shipwrecks where no navigational error could explain the loss, giving rise to a mixture of fear, respect, and awe. Some older mariners still claim that the note carries whispers of the past, voices of those lost returning through the ocean itself. Still, the whistling returns without reason or pattern. Acoustic surveys in the late 20th century captured intermittent signals labelled Cape Whistler. Yet when researchers tried to match them to storms, tides, or geological features, the results proved inconsistent. Contemporary mariners report the phenomenon even in calm, clear conditions. One diver noted that underwater hydrophone arrays captured faint repetitions of the whistling at depths exceeding 60 feet, yet the apparent source remained untraceable. The pattern is fleeting, recurring at intervals untraceable by prediction, suggesting that the sound is neither bound to time nor entirely constrained by physics. Some scientists now suspect that the combination of the Cape's unique bathymetry and air pressure variations may allow the sound to skip across distances, but no definitive mechanism has yet been confirmed. Perhaps the ocean was never silent. It only waits for someone willing to listen long enough. Vanishing icebergs. A massive wall of ice loomed over the horizon, then vanished without warning. Crews aboard passing vessels swore they had seen a hulking mass of frozen water, jagged and blue, drifting slowly with the currents, only for it to disappear as though the ocean had swallowed it whole. Mariners reported no collision, no calving, and no sudden storm to explain the absence. Observers struggled to reconcile the enormity of what they saw with the stark emptiness that remained, leaving a disquiet that lingered longer than the chill of the polar winds. In these moments, the ocean seemed to contract, compressing vast spaces into a sudden void where once an iceberg had stood. Long before satellites could track them, whalers and explorers noted ice that seemed to evaporate from the sea. In the 19th century, ships navigating the Labrador Current recorded icebergs visible for hours one day and gone by the next, with logs questioning whether the mind played tricks amid the monotony of endless white and grey. Early Antarctic expeditions noted the same phenomenon. A vessel's lookout would mark a colossal ice formation drifting near the horizon, only for the same formation to vanish by nightfall. These early observations, often dismissed as illusion or error, persisted in accounts across generations, leaving a record that hints at something inexplicable beyond simple drift and melting. Modern oceanographers understand the drift and melting of icebergs in detail, yet some cases defy even these calculations. Scientists track the trajectories of icebergs using satellite imagery, factoring in ocean currents, wind, temperature, and salinity, yet occasionally a tracked mass will simply disappear from observation. Some have suggested that hidden undersea topography could guide icebergs into submerged channels, allowing them to slip from view, but direct evidence remains scarce. Even with these mechanisms, the speed and completeness of certain disappearances challenge conventional understanding, hinting at phenomena that resist full measurement. Crew members aboard research vessels describe watching a hulking iceberg fade from sight as if swallowed by the water itself. On the Southern Ocean, near the Antarctic Peninsula, scientists report fog-heavy mornings where a vessel approaches a luminous blue wall of ice, only for it to vanish within an hour, leaving the crew disoriented and the ship adrift in a pale expanse of ocean. Commercial vessels along the North Atlantic recount similar experiences. Radar returns suggest ice where none appears visually, then vanish entirely, with compasses and sonar confirming no physical anomaly. The psychological toll is notable. Crews describe a sense of vertigo and unreality, as though the ocean has manipulated perception itself. Scientists have also examined ocean eddies and subsurface currents that move ice in ways invisible to the surface. These circular currents can trap icebergs and redirect them far from their predicted paths, occasionally drawing them into hidden underwater troughs or away from the main flow of surface currents. In some cases, icebergs that should have been visible for days suddenly vanish from satellite images, only to appear weeks later hundreds of miles away. Research expeditions in the Labrador Sea and Weddell Sea have documented these unexpected drifts, noting that variations in water density, salinity, and temperature can accelerate the process. Combined with fog, mirages, and optical illusions, these physical forces can make a massive iceberg seem to disappear entirely, yet the exact mechanism behind the most extreme vanishings remains unresolved. Temperature gradients, fog banks, and optical illusions may all play a role in the seeming disappearance. Cold water layers can bend light in unusual ways, producing mirages that place ice in a position it does not occupy, while shifting fog can conceal massive forms in minutes. Icebergs are also subject to rapid carving beneath the waterline, invisible to observers on deck, and the reflective properties of ice can exaggerate or diminish apparent size. These factors create a confluence of circumstances that might explain some disappearances, Yet dozens of reports persist in which ice vanished under conditions that would normally allow complete visibility, defying the known behaviour of light and matter. For generations, sailors told tales of ghost ice that signalled storm or doom. In New England, Northern Europe, and along the Antarctic coast, folklore preserved warnings about ice that walked on water or vanished into the deep. Whalers recounted icebergs that disappeared only to reappear elsewhere, sometimes blocking narrow passages with impossible timing. These legends were woven into navigational caution, and while they may exaggerate reality, they preserve a kernel of observation, that the ocean can conceal its largest forms with a speed and subtlety that human eyes cannot always follow. Despite precise tracking and satellite imaging, some icebergs vanish in ways that no model can explain. Even in the era of remote sensing, anomalies persist. Certain ice masses, once confirmed in radar and optical tracking, have disappeared entirely within hours, leaving researchers to speculate whether undersea channels, rapid carving, or unknown currents might guide them into hidden recesses. Observations suggest these events are rare, yet they continue to occur in both hemispheres, leaving the most experienced scientists to acknowledge that the ocean's behaviour sometimes exceeds human prediction. As it moves, some ice drifts into a place so remote that even the horizon cannot trace its path. Maritime time. Anomalies. Time stretched and contracted aboard the vessel in ways the crew could neither measure nor explain. Watches ticked irregularly, sometimes lagging by hours, and the ship's chronometers failed to match the logs maintained in the cabin. Crew members recounted seeing a misty horizon that seemed to flicker with images from previous days, as though the sea itself were layering memories over the present. Even experienced officers, accustomed to the quirks of long voyages, felt unmoored. Compass bearings and celestial fixes contradicted one another, and a sense of disorientation settled over the deck that no map or instrument could resolve. For days, the crew moved through time as if it were a physical current, invisible yet inescapable. Records from the 19th century describe ships arriving at ports days or even weeks out of sync with their logs. Merchant vessels crossing the Atlantic occasionally reported days missing from their entries, with officers puzzled by discrepancies between their position and expected passage times. Early naval archives recount instances in which ships, following well-established courses, reported celestial observations that conflicted with charts. In some cases, entire voyages seemed to collapse into brief periods, leaving logs that implied impossible speeds or durations. Officers wrote in disbelief, questioning the accuracy of both their instruments and their own senses, leaving behind historical records that hinted at phenomena no one could define. In modern patrol reports, crews sometimes note entire hours missing from chronometers or radar readings that contradict the clock. Submarines navigating the North Atlantic in the mid-20th century recorded shifts in log entries where one day appeared to blend into another. Research vessels mapping polar waters have similarly documented sudden gaps in their automated recordings, sometimes accompanied by distorted readings from gyroscopes or sonar equipment. Even satellite-assisted navigation does not always resolve these anomalies. Multiple officers corroborated the discrepancies, yet no mechanical failure could account for them. Some anomalies appear to coincide with regions of strong ocean currents or magnetic variance, suggesting a subtle interaction between natural forces and temporal perception. Unusual tidal currents, magnetic anomalies, and gravitational variations have led scientists to speculate that both instruments and perception may be affected. In polar regions, magnetic declination can vary dramatically over short distances, affecting compass readings and navigational calculations. Strong tidal eddies and swirling currents may subtly alter a ship's speed, creating misalignments between observed and recorded positions. Gravitational anomalies, while minor, could contribute to measurement errors in sensitive instruments, particularly those relying on gyroscopic guidance. These forces, however, remain insufficient to explain reports in which temporal distortions appeared extreme, such as logs showing entire days skipped, or repeated events recorded as if the ship was simultaneously in two different positions. An uncanny sense of repeated days haunts sailors, as if hours have been stolen from their voyage. One officer recounted waking at dawn to find the ship in the same coordinates as the previous evening, logs indicating that time had advanced far more than his own perception suggested. Watches and clocks on deck ran erratically, while the engine room's mechanical timing seemed unaffected, creating a division between human observation and mechanical measurement. The monotony of the open ocean, combined with isolation, fatigue, and extreme weather, may have amplified the crew's sense of temporal irregularity, yet multiple accounts indicate that even when rested and alert, the discrepancies persisted. Some sailors reported seeing celestial objects in positions inconsistent with the time recorded on their instruments, reinforcing the sensation that the natural order of time itself had been warped. Examining ocean eddies and hidden subsurface currents, scientists suggest these forces could account for certain unexplained anomalies. Circular currents, particularly in the North Atlantic and Southern Ocean, can subtly divert a ship from its predicted path, making elapsed travel time appear inconsistent. Icebergs, floating debris, and transient whirlpools may influence small vessels' drift, creating a gap between observed movement and actual speed. In rare instances, these factors might synchronize with magnetic irregularities to produce conditions where a ship's temporal measurements do not match reality, leaving sailors convinced that hours or days had been lost, duplicated, or reordered. Some lost ships re-emerged after weeks or months, appearing intact and carrying crews who could not reconcile elapsed time. In one documented case, a merchant vessel was reported missing for 3 weeks before being spotted drifting near its intended route. Its logs contained entries that suggested continuous sailing, but the calendar and celestial observations implied a temporal gap impossible to reconcile. Similar cases were recorded in the early 20th century, when naval vessels disappeared from patrols and were later found operating normally, crews unaware of any missing days. Each incident was corroborated by multiple officers, leaving official investigators to label the occurrences as unexplained temporal anomalies and sparking speculation about unseen forces influencing time over open water. Anomalies continue to confound scientists and mariners, even with precise navigation, celestial charts, and atomic clocks. Even with modern GPS systems, electronic timekeeping and satellite monitoring reports occasionally emerge of vessels experiencing gaps in recorded time or observing repeated environmental events. Researchers have documented these anomalies without finding any definitive cause, leading to speculation that the ocean itself may exert subtle influences on human perception and measurement. The persistence of such phenomena suggests a layer of reality at sea that resists full comprehension, where time is neither entirely linear nor entirely reliable. Noting patterns in historical records, maritime historians found that certain accounts coincide with geomagnetic anomalies or abnormal weather events. Sunspot activity, auroral displays, and intense storms appear in records near the times of reported anomalies, though no causal link has been proven. Logbooks sometimes note strange phenomena in addition to temporal shifts, compass swings, sudden fogs, and distorted echoes over the water. Such details, repeated across centuries and regions, suggest that the phenomenon is not purely psychological, but may involve an interplay between natural forces and perception, leaving sailors to navigate both the physical and temporal mysteries of the sea. Twisting the flow of time around every vessel, the ocean leaves its mark without taking life.